So just a little bit of channel admin to go. I can definitely confirm that every single prize for the 100k subscribers giveaway competition has long ago left this building. So I know some of you have received it, received their prizes, because I've got messages from you saying as much. So if you haven't received your prize at this point, please do get in contact with me, and I shall furnish you with the tracking number, etc., so that you can determine where the heck it's gone. I know there is a little bit of upheaval in the international postal system at the moment due to the coronavirus, but mostly that seems to be affecting things like Kickstarters and such, where they're all being manufactured in China, so hopefully it shouldn't be affecting international postage across from the UK to non-Chinese countries all that much, thank goodness. But you never know. I say, if you haven't received it by now, please let me know. Other than that, the only other thing I think that's worth mentioning at this point in admin is that I'm going to try a slightly different format of Wednesday special for a video coming up in the next probably maybe 3 or 4 months. I'm going to do a special on the Battle of Sluis, and I'm going to get some of the people in my medieval reenactment group involved, and we're going to try and portray it almost kind of like, you know, the historical interviews where documentaries where they interview survivors and such, like, so sort of in character, in full kit, etc. Give it a little bit more of a flavour. So if you think that's a good idea, let me know. If you think it's a terrible idea, equally let me know. As I say, it'll be an experiment, and so we'll see how it goes. So, of course, we are now into the first week of March, and, well, it's only 1 month before I grace the shores of the United States of America. But until then, you'll have to put up with me answering Patreon questions this week. So, yes, buckle in. I have no idea how long this is going to take, but let's see how it goes. The Hand of Ray asks, what is your impression of the cancelled successor to the Audacious-class aircraft carriers, the Malta-class aircraft carriers? So the Malta-class are very interesting. They're effectively the British equivalent of the American Midway class. Now, whilst obviously that means they would have been very large, and theoretically therefore would have stood the Royal Navy in better stead in terms of retention, when you think about the Audacious-class Ark Royal and Eagle basically being the mainstay of British carrier aviation through until the 1970s, these ships, I say, theoretically slightly more capable due to their considerably greater size. However, I'm kind of glad that they didn't get built in the end, and that's because of the design confluence between the two major carrier building nations that on the Western, well, that is the British and the Americans. As we've mentioned in other videos, the Americans took a look at British lessons, and at the end of sort of the World War II period, they came up with the Midways, and one of the major lessons that they learned was the need to protect their hangar decks, and so the Midways had armoured flight decks. The British, meanwhile, looked at the American lessons and thought that launching mass airstrikes in a single go was a much better idea than the relatively smaller strike packages the armoured carriers had been able to put up. And so they went with an American-style open hangar, but also an armoured hangar deck, not an armoured flight deck. So in design principle, the Maltas were closer to something like the Essexes than they were to the British armoured hangar, armoured flight deck carriers. Now, whilst the Midway was a superb carrier, and the Midway class showed that by their sheer longevity, the Malta class, I think, went a little bit too far towards the mid-World War II American design paradigm, in as much as it had the open flight deck, which is great. That's obviously the open hangar, which is a good idea. But moving the armour down to the armoured hangar deck as opposed to the armoured flight deck, I think, was a mistake in the design. I can understand why they did it. I mean, there's always the grass is greener on the other side approach. but a Malta that was more closely aligned with a Midway style design, i.e. not an armoured hangar deck, but with an armoured flight deck, would have given a nice balance between protection and ability to operate large numbers of aircraft, as opposed to the completely enclosed armoured box that made up the majority of the British armoured flight deck armoured hangar carriers, which was the main reason why they were so cramped and therefore restricted going into the post-war period. Now, it's not just about protection, it's also about ability to operate aircraft, because aircraft, as well as we know, got heavier and heavier and heavier, and a Midway, for example, with several inches of steel making up its flight deck, you're going to have to put a heck of a load on that before you break through. Whereas an unarmoured flight deck can obviously, of necessity, be built lighter and therefore weaker. And whilst that would have been fine for operating aircraft in the late 40s, early 50s, maybe pushing it into the 60s, I have a feeling by the time you got around something the size and scale of the F4 Phantom II, they might well be regretting the fact that the flight deck is not as strong as it could otherwise have been. So, in that respect, it's probably better the Malta class didn't get built, because the Malta class would have, well, they would have effectively taken the place of Ark, Royal and Eagle, however many of them that got constructed, and then the Royal Navy would have faced a very short, sharp shock when it suddenly turned out that in the era of modern jet aircraft, their giant aircraft carriers couldn't operate the biggest and heaviest of the modern fighters and bombers, etc. So, unless they got something like CVA-01 in to replace them, that would have been quite bad. Whereas, even with the CVA-01 cancellation, the Audacious class were able to continue onwards. Now, if they'd made that slight tweak and put the armoured deck at the flight deck levels, then I would have been completely different tune. It would have been, yes, definitely build the Maltas, because then you could hang on to them for as long as they hung on to Eagle and Ark Royal, and they're probably even longer with refits. I mean, you see how long the Midway stayed in service, for example. TC Green asks, at the time of launch, which ship was more powerful compared to its contemporaries, HMS Warrior or HMS Dreadnaught? And my answer to that is HMS Warrior by a country mile. That might come as a surprise to some, but let me explain my reasoning. HMS Dreadnaught was an iterative design step in terms of battleships. Armour-wise, sure, its armour was a little bit thicker than previous pre-Dreadnought designs, but not all. There were some pre-Dreadnoughts that were almost as well protected. Speed-wise, okay, fair enough, it was a fair bit faster. 3 knots doesn't sound like too much, but it's a fair chunk faster than the average pre-Dreadnought. And then guns, yes, it had more guns, but its guns were the same as pretty much the last generation of pre-Dreadnoughts. Indeed, in order to finish it faster, they stole the guns that were intended for the Lord Nelson class pre-Dreadnoughts, because they were quite literally the same guns and the same turrets. So Dreadnought's main advancement was putting all these new things together. It was a bit faster than everyone else, and it had new fire control systems, and it went around with all these big guns. But when you compared it to a last generation pre-Dreadnoughts, like say a Lord Nelson or a Danton or a Connecticut, etc., etc., those ships could still hurt a Dreadnought. Okay, 1-on-1 they'd lose, but 2-on-1? Okay, maybe Dreadnought would still beat them. 3-on-1? 4-on-1? Nah, now things are looking bad. And even in a 2-on-1 or a 1-on-1 matchup, the 12-inch guns that were equipped on the last generation pre-Dreadnoughts could still hurt HMS Dreadnought. So it was superior, but it wasn't massively, invincible. Whereas, if you look at HMS Warrior, when HMS Warrior came out, it was a step change far greater than that. At the time of her launch, there was no ship of anything approaching Warrior's scale that could catch her, which in turn obviously meant Warrior could run down pretty much any ship in the water. Her armament, okay, fair enough, the 68-pounder and the 110 could be found on other ships, but the number of them, combined with the fact she had a Martin's shell forge, and, well, that it was uniform armament, her armament was top of the line, kind of like HMS Dreadnaughts, but where it really comes into play is the armour. Warrior's armour was specifically configured to be basically immune to every single gun present or at the time known to be in development. And they succeeded. It basically couldn't be sunk by gunfire by other ships that were in service at the time. And it was massively superior to La Gloire, which was its only real competitor at the time. Now, fair enough, 4 or 5 years down the line, there were guns that could pierce its armour, and 10 years down the line it was basically a second-line ship. But A, that's kind of the level of technological change that was going on at the time, and B, well, if you look at 1916, HMS Dreadnought isn't looking spectacular either, lined up against things like the Queen Elizabeth, the Bayern, and the New Mexicos are just being laid down around at that point. So can't really hold that against Warrior. But yeah, it basically comes down to for the 2 or 3 years immediately after its launch, Warrior was pretty much unbeatable at sea, whereas the 2 or 3 years after its launch, HMS Dreadnought was certainly king of the hill, but could be dethroned by group action. Golf 2428 asks, say that Project Habakkuk was actually made, ignoring any logistics of building it or any good arguments against it actually existing, what would its impact be? Would it be stationed, assuming that it gets there without melting or sinking? Or where would it be stationed? What aircraft do you think would be on it, and do you think it would be effective in its role? Also, would it keep cool and not melt? So assuming they got one of these things running, I think its main station would probably be exactly where they designed it to be, which would have been in the middle of the Atlantic to help close the mid-Atlantic gap. Now, fair enough, by the time they've actually built the thing, chances are things like the B-24, etc. will have closed the mid-Atlantic gap to a certain extent anyway, but it would allow the basing of significant numbers of smaller, faster attack aircraft, etc. in the middle of the Atlantic, which would have allowed for more active prosecution of U-boats. So I think that's where it probably would have been stationed. You don't really need it off the northern coast of Europe because, well, you already have Britain there as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Depending on the time it enters service, I mean, assuming it enters service for some reason, sort of 43-ish, there's not really a lot of point sending it to the Mediterranean, A, because, well, it's difficult to melt, but sending it to the Mediterranean is just asking for trouble. But B, also, I have serious concerns about the thing actually being able to clear the Straits of Gibraltar. And being slow, it would be subject to relentless air attack in that area. The only other area other than the Atlantic that I can see it possibly being deployed in, if it's completed in late 43 or something like that, would be maybe you load it up with several hundred strike aircraft and go tootling off towards Norway and try and basically pull off a Pearl Harbor style strike off of one flight deck at the Tirpitz. But that would be interesting, considering its relatively slow speed. You'd think the Germans might notice it coming. Not that they could do a tremendous amount about it, but there you go. In terms of aircraft, probably all the standard Royal Navy stuff. You probably see like a Sea Mosquito or Sea Beaufighter kind of thing. I don't think they'd go on for full strategic bombers, but certainly a lot of the twin-engined aircraft, as I say, like the Mosquito and the Beaufighter, would probably see their deployment. And also, to be honest, land-based fighters, because at its size, the concerns about using things like the Tempest, Typhoon, Spitfire, etc., that were very much real when it came to using them on normal aircraft carriers have probably gone away somewhat. So possibly more capable strike aircraft in that respect. Would it have been effective? Well, in the mid-Atlantic gap, yeah, probably, assuming the Germans don't try and wolf pack it to death. Would it have kept cool and not melt? Well, there's plenty of icebergs in the Atlantic. With the appropriate systems, given that it took a couple of years to melt one that was smaller in Canada without any refrigeration systems. I think with refrigeration systems and such, I don't think there's a tremendous risk of it melting away before the war's end. Leon Wu asks how watches or shifts work on a warship. How many are there? How many hours are there in a watch? Do you get lunch in that watch? How's it handled, etc.? Well, the answer to this is that there is no single answer. There are numerous ways of dividing up the watches aboard various ships, and yeah, it would take far too long to try and explain every single one in detail, but broadly speaking, when you're talking about watches aboard ships, the first thing you need to work out is how many effectively crews are there, because you can't run a ship on a single quote-unquote crew because people have to sleep at some point, and shockingly enough, on a ship you can't just have the whole crew go to sleep overnight because then bad things tend to happen. So a ship's crew will be made up of several teams, and those teams will take turns at going on watch, which in turn means that you can then run the ship 24/7. So there are watch systems aboard some warships that use two teams. They can be called something like Gold and Blue, Port and Starboard, Alpha and Bravo, or whatever you want to call them. And in those sections, obviously, work is divided up between the two. Whereas in other navies, you can also try running them in three watch units. And obviously, at that point, then you effectively turn the ship over between three separate teams of people. One thing that's relatively common across most watch systems is the idea of at least one shorter watch period. Depending on the system, this can either be in the dead hours of the night, so around about between 9-10 o'clock at night through to 2-3 in the morning, again depending on the navy, or sometimes it will be in the late afternoon, where they might take a standard watch period and split it in half to allow everybody to eat around about the same time. Now, one feature that's common in most watch systems is that the watches will be divided into segments that are divisible by 24 for obvious reasons. So 4, 6 and 8 hour watches are found across various navies, although there is also a system where you can have a set of 5-hour watches, but then obviously that leaves you with a single 4-hour watch, and that tends to be the one that is pretty short over the middle of the night. So yeah, there's all sorts of various combinations you can use in that. One thing that is fairly common though across most warships is a 3-day cycle. In some watch systems you'll just have exactly the same duty at exactly the same time every day, but that can get repetitive and boring very quickly. So usually most watch systems will use a 3-day cycle where you will be alternating back and forth. So let's take an example of, say you've got a morning watch, which might, depending on the navy, but let's say it's running about from say 7 till just before lunch, so 7 to 11, 7 till 12, something like that. You'll be on that shift one day, and then the next day the other team will be on that, and you'll get the earlier morning or the early afternoon shift instead, and that helps keep things livened up. So yes, there's some examples, but as I say, unfortunately there is no uniform system of watches, either in terms of number of teams or in number of hours. So, and even within an individual navy, depending on the operational needs of the ship, the watch system on an aircraft carrier might be very different to the watch system on a ballistic missile submarine. Do you get lunch in the watch? No. Not usually, not unless you're locked up at action stations and you've had to be there for ridiculous amounts of time. Almost every watch system that I've come across has a break between watches around either 12 or 1 o'clock, which allows you to feed the crew that are about to go on watch, and then feed the crew that have just come off of watch. So you generally wouldn't be at meal while you are actually on watch. Well, for obvious reasons, it's very difficult to try and fire a gun or man an engine or shovel coal into a boiler or whatever else it is you need to do when you're also trying to eat a decent food assuming, of course, that your Navy does serve decent food, which, depending on the era and depending on the Navy, may be called into question. Luke Jewis asks, how large would an aircraft carrier of the Second World War have had to be to operate medium bombers such as the B-25 Mitchell? Would this have served a useful purpose, or just how non-practical would it have been? Well, assuming that we're talking about a navalised version with folding wings, arrestor hook, etc., the very, very first thing you've got to work out is what exactly you define by medium bomber. Now, obviously, you've given the example of a B-25 Mitchell, but to give a certain, say, level of example, the B-25 is certainly a medium bomber. The de Havilland Mosquito is also a medium bomber. But when you compare the two, the B-25 is about 8 foot longer and has at least a good 13 foot on the wingspan. Height-wise is near enough as makes no difference, but basically the B-25 is a considerably larger aircraft, so trying to operate something like a B-25 is going to be considerably harder logistically than operating something like a Mosquito, even though both are, in fact, medium bombers. Now, obviously, the Doolittle raid proved that technically you could fly B-25 off of a carrier, albeit that's not necessarily the wisest of ideas. They did have to be specially light, and you definitely can't land one on a Yorktown. But your single biggest problem is going to be the deck elevators to get them down into the hangars. Even folded, it would be an incredibly tight squeeze to get a wings folded B-25 on the elevator of an Essex class, and that'd just be the one aircraft. So you'd be bringing them up onto deck, wings folded, and then having to basically set them up on deck. So something like a Midway class elevator size wouldn't necessarily be a problem. The sheer scale of the aircraft, though, would mean you'd have very, very few in the hangar. And to be perfectly honest, I don't even think a Midway is large enough to really land something like this very often. Now, we do actually have a fairly decent metric, weirdly enough, for the B-25 in the C2 Greyhound, because it's of roughly similar dimensions and weights. So you can kind of look at the aircraft carriers that can operate that and kind of take a reading. So the smallest carrier that I could come across that successfully operates the C2 Greyhound is the French Charles de Gaulle. So that kind of gives you an approximate idea of size, albeit that obviously it's not going to carry that many of them. Would it have served a useful purpose? Probably not. I mean, by the time you have an aircraft carrier that can carry a meaningful number of medium bombers, aircraft in general have grown to about that size. Something like an F-14, at which point you don't need a medium bomber, you just need a large fighter. So yeah, the only possible reason that I can think of to build a large enough aircraft carrier in the Second World War to operate a medium bomber would have been some kind of bizarre situation wherein Japan somehow magically fortified all of the various islands that it took to a point that it was impractical to take them, at which point you try and launch a strategic bombing campaign on Japan using big aircraft carriers. But yeah, no, there's not really a practical situation for launching large numbers of medium bombers from any kind of practical size aircraft carrier into the Second World War. Robert Henry Ilston asks, did any navies try to develop point defence systems against torpedoes, eyed by firing projectiles at them to explode or disrupt their track? It has been tried at various points. However, they've always run into problems. As can be seen here, this was a rather ambitious anti-torpedo torpedo system, along with a combined with active sonar that was installed on US carriers. But after half a decade of trying, they couldn't get the blasted thing to work, and they're now ripping it out. So there have been the occasional lucky shot that's taken out a torpedo. I mean, there's an account of even a merchantman where a guy with a rifle managed to blow up an incoming German torpedo by taking a blind shot with a 303. But that's very few and far between, and almost certainly caused by the fact the torpedo is running shallow. Basically, the problem is the medium the torpedo travels through. Water is hugely shock absorbent. I mean, that's one of the reasons why torpedo explosions are so lethal, because the water prevents the explosion from going in much of any direction other than into the ship, where there's air, which is much easier for the explosion to vent into. And so if you try and shoot at it with a shell, the shell's either going to break up or stop moving in very shortly after entering the water, and torpedoes can run a lot deeper than that. And with the really big guns, well, you don't tend to be able to depress them down to the point where you can reliably engage a torpedo at relatively close range. And even if you somehow could, say, the explosion of a shell that detonates nearby probably won't affect a torpedo all that much, because, again, the water damping the explosion and the fact the torpedo is actually moving at a fair old clip. So people forget torpedoes weigh well over a ton, even by World War I standards, and probably more than that now. So to kill a torpedo, you'd basically have to drop a ridiculous amount of explosive somewhere nearby, something like along the lines of a depth charge, and you'd have to have it sink down to the right depth, which is a bit of an interception problem when you're talking about a torpedo that's moving relatively quickly underwater, and the limitations on the speed of things sinking underwater. Or you'd have to engage it directly with something that impacts it with enough force to kill it, which would be either another torpedo or an anti-torpedo torpedo. And as we said, both of those have had problems in even working now in the 21st century. So, various navies at various times have tried. No one, so far to my knowledge, has actually succeeded. Douglas Peck asks a couple of fairly substantial questions. One of which boils down to, effectively, have I read the book Malta Convoys by David A. Thomas, and how accurate is it? And there's personal reasons he's asking that question. And secondly, also related to that, do you know if the Royal Navy recorded an archived service history of when sailors were transferred to various ships? And if so, is there any way for someone not a citizen of the UK to look up or inquire about this, the service history of a particular sailor? In terms of the book Malta Convoys, I can't give you a straight answer right now, because I actually do have the book. It's sitting on my shelf, but it is sitting in the queue of books to read, as by various methods, both by purchase and by kind donation from subscribers, I seem to be acquiring new books at the rate of about 2 or 3 a week, and I can only read so fast. Well, to be honest, I could probably read them all if I had the time, but I don't have the time, so I think I'm gradually falling behind on my reading list. But yes, so when I actually have had a chance to read through it, I will be able to give you a more accurate answer on that. Now, in terms of the other question, that much I can definitely help you with, because I've been through this process a few times myself. So yes, the service records of men in the Royal Navy will always record when they served on various ships and when they transferred to new ships, so as well as obviously various other bits and pieces. So that kind of information, if that's what you're looking for, is definitely there. Now, in terms of trying to get that information, what you need to do is go to the gov.uk website, which is where the UK government basically puts everything these days, and the exact web link is very long, but basically if you search UK government copy of military service records, it should be the first or second result on Google. Once you're there, you have 4 options: overview, which you can read if you want, apply for your own records, which is not the case, or apply for the records of someone who's deceased, which is what you'll select, and if you want to complain, which hopefully you won't. So when you're applying for the record of someone who is deceased, then I'll just read it from the government website. It says, you can apply for a copy of someone else's service records if any of the following apply. If you're the immediate next of kin, for example, a spouse, parent, or lone surviving child, or you have consent from their immediate next of kin, or you have a general research interest in this, but in that case you'll only have limited information unless the person in question died more than 25 years ago. You will need to know their full name, their date of birth, and their service number. And then there are two forms to fill in, a request form and a search form, and then that you can download. There's two form options, one if you are next of kin, or you have next of kin's consent, and the other one if you don't and you're just looking for general information. And that's the request form. And then there's the search form, which they've got a section for the Royal Navy, section for the Army, section for the RAF. It will cost about 30 quid plus postage, and then you will end up, hopefully, with the records that you would like. So, yes, if you want to do some research, as you've indicated in your Patreon question you actually do, then good luck with that, and hopefully that you'll get the results you want. If you need any help, please drop me a line via email, and I'll try and guide you through the process as much as I can. As I said, I've been through this process 4 or 5 times for various people in my immediate family who've been in the military. My various great uncles, as I've alluded to in previous videos, my great grandfather, and my great great grandfather. Although, as it turned out, the steps I should have taken for the latter two were to go to something like Ancestry.org, because those records are available for free, because they predate 1920. Matt Blom asks, I read in the book The Rules of the Game, Jutland and British Naval Command by Andrew Gordon that British officers paid out of their own pockets to repaint their ships. How did this tradition get started, and why would the Admiralty of the world's superpower not pay for this? Well, the answer is that the Royal Navy would pay for ships to be painted, but there's a difference between what is militarily necessary for a ship to be painted and what officers might like. So where this tradition got started was all the way back in the Age of Sail, and it was for pretty much the same reasons. The Navy would pay for a ship to be painted where it was necessary, i.e. to preserve its structure against weathering, whether that be wood or iron or steel. The Navy would allow a certain amount of weathering to take place on the paint, and once it reached a certain level, then the Navy would repaint it. There were 2 issues with this for officers, though, quite often, one of which was that the Navy would provide only paint in Navy colours, which, well, if you're in the First World War period, is varying shades of the colour grey. And back in the Age of Sail, obviously red, yellow, black, that kind of stuff. And so if you wanted the ship painted any other kind of colour of any description, or you just wanted to trim the ship in fancy colours, especially in Victorian era when peacetime colour schemes were a thing, the Royal Navy wasn't going to fork out for that. Or if you wanted a better quality of paint, for example, the Royal Navy wasn't going to fork out for that either. So you would have to pay over for that. And the other thing is, especially in the latter part of the 19th century and in various other phases of the Royal Navy's history, there was quite the obsession with the ship being spick and span. And one of the easiest ways to make a ship spick and span was to repaint it, because, well, if any of you have tried to scrub coal dust out of anything, you'll know it's pretty much a hiding to nothing. So it was much easier to just go, slap another coat of paint on it. And again, the Royal Navy was in the business of preserving its ships against rust. It was not in the business of paying to repaint the ship every 5 minutes because there was a speck of dirt somewhere. So if the officers really wanted to keep their ships looking absolutely pristine 100% of the time, that was going to require a lot of paint, and, well, then it was time to reach into your own wallet. Emerald Leafeon asks, what is your favourite ship that was entirely impractical? I think most favourite impractical ship has to go to the Tessera Contemporaries. I think that's how it's pronounced. I know there's a few Greek viewers, so if I've horribly butchered that, my apologies, please correct me. But yes, this was just some absolutely gargantuan, monstrous thing that was built in the immediate pre-Roman period in the Mediterranean. And this picture doesn't necessarily entirely do it justice, albeit that the size is probably about right. well, you can see the little trireme down there. Imagine one of those, as you can see, supersized, except now there are two of them arranged in a catamaran formation with a giant deck in between, kind of like a weird wooden oar-propelled aircraft carrier. It was reputedly so ridiculously impractical that they basically launched it, went, well, we managed to do a thing. We have literally no idea what we're going to do with it now, so we're going to quietly shuffle it off into a harbour and forget about it, because that's all a bit embarrassing. I mean, there's really big stuff that was built in the ancient world, like the Syracusia, for example, but at least that had some practical use. This thing appeared to be kind of, well, as I say, they got it into the water and then realised the ridiculous numbers of men needed to man it basically meant it couldn't go anywhere because it would run out of food and water long before it got to its destination. So that was fun. Basically building a small artificial island with a couple of ram bows. Bill Luster asks, did Germany try using blockade runners in the Atlantic during the World Wars? I thought I read something about U-boats visiting America in 1917 at one point. So yes, blockade runners were tried in both World Wars. In both World Wars, the surface blockade runners eventually, well, actually relatively quickly came to a halt. During World War One, that was basically because to get into German-held waters, you had to come through the English Channel or via the North Sea, and both of those were heavily blockaded by the Royal Navy, so very few surface ships actually got through, and the ones that did basically either got through badly damaged or with such limited cargo it just wasn't worth it. So that ran out pretty quickly. There were a couple of merchant submarines, the Deutschland and Bremen, which, Bremen went missing on its first voyage, but Deutschland actually made a number of voyages, specialising, as you might imagine, for a 1,500-ton odd submarine in low-volume, high-value goods. So rare materials, gems, money, things like nickel and such like medication. All of this kind of stuff was carried by those merchant submarines, although with America entering the war, the number of its voyages weren't too great. They also did try famously resupplying their East African section with a blockade-running Zeppelin, but that didn't work out for them quite as well as they'd hoped. In the Second World War, despite the advance of naval technology, surface blockade runners actually lasted a bit longer. That was largely down to the fact that Germany had managed to capture France and so could send ships out from the French Atlantic ports, which of course, until Allied air power and submarines etc. really got going, made it very hard to intercept the ships just after they'd left. And the sea is a very big place. Without things like really powerful radars, massive numbers of search aircraft and satellites, it was very difficult then to track down surface blockade runners once they'd gotten out into the Atlantic, as opposed to when Germany was just confined to Germany. There were obviously the natural choke points that we mentioned before. Still, once Allied air power and shipping did really get going, it was very difficult for the surface blockade runners to work, so another set of cargo submarines, albeit these ones converted actual U-boats as opposed to purpose-designed cargo subs, did try and go on missions. Obviously, the US entered the war significantly earlier, proportional to the length of the war in World War II as compared to World War I, so that was off the table. But there was a limited amount of trade between Japan and Germany via various submarines, and the occasional attempt by aircraft, although, again, not really that practical in this time period. NickBoy302 asks 3 questions. During and after the Meiji Restoration, the Imperial Japanese Army based itself heavily off of the Prussian or German army. Did the Imperial Japanese Navy base itself so heavily on other navies, or was it more flexible in whom it imitated? Second, do you think the actions of ordinary seaman Teddy Sheean during the sinking of HMAS Armandale were deserving of a Victoria Cross? And third, why do stokers have such a bad reputation? Well, in classic reverse order, stokers have a bad reputation effectively based on class and tradition-based snobbery in the Age of Sail in the 19th century. That is because when stokers first had to come aboard a ship, we were still very much in the era of the Age of Sail, wooden warships, etc., etc. And unfortunately, they also came about in a period where, at least in the Western European world, there wasn't a vast amount of actual naval conflict, which meant that the various navies were setting a little bit into the whole we must have everything pretty and well painted and clean, otherwise our life is not worth living phase, at least as far as the officers were concerned. And we are still in a period when the officers were pretty much almost entirely made up of people from the aristocracy, or if they were really scraping the bottom of the barrel, the gentry. Stokers, on the other hand, tended to come from, shall we say, some of the more practical classes of the various nations, obviously Britain, France in particular. And with their fires and their soot and their smoke and their coal dust, they tended to make everything, including themselves and all the lovely pristine sails, just a little bit dirty. Which didn't go down very well with all the officers who were obsessed with everything being spick and span and nice and polished, because a ship that was still entirely sail-powered could make a rightful mockery of the absolute state that a sailing steamship was in by the time any kind of meaningful voyage was done. Never mind the fact the sailing steamship probably got there quicker and also had far less chance of running aground, but there you go. And as a result, the stokers were looked down upon on both grounds. They were dirtying up the ship, and they didn't particularly care, and also they were the social inferiors of the officers, by and large, to the point that in the Royal Navy, for example, although the incredibly complex skills of naval engineering were recognised to the point that entire schools were set up specifically to train such valuable artificers and stokers and engineering officers, those officers were still excluded from the general officers' mess and wardroom for quite a while, and also not even technically permitted to be on the same rank structure again for quite a few decades. So they were kind of viewed as a necessary evil for a lot of the time, and thus they developed a bit of a reputation based on that hearsay. Which is a bit unfortunate, really, because at the end of the day, without them, your ship ain't going anywhere fast. Now, for the story of Teddy Sheean, it's necessary to give a bit of a background as to what on earth he was doing and why he might be eligible for Victoria Cross. So the potted history of the relevant parts, at least, are that Sheean was assigned to HMS Armidale, which was a rather small corvette, locally built in Australia, that was used for all sorts of purposes, but direct combat with the enemy, unless they were a submarine, wasn't really supposed to be one of them. It found itself travelling alone, which it probably shouldn't have done, given that its original plan was to rendezvous with another ship whilst in company with a third, so it should have been a 3-ship formation, but it wasn't, and they were wandering around doing their own thing. They then got attacked by a baker's dozen of Japanese aircraft, which did not go well for the corvette, unsurprisingly enough. The corvette was hit by torpedoes as well as bombs, both with the bombs both hits and near misses, and unsurprisingly, when you put a couple of torpedoes into a roughly 1,000-ton corvette, it tends to sink relatively quickly. Plus, of course, the Japanese were strafing the thing. So, rather understandably, the crew was evacuating out to their boats, the ones that had survived the attack at least. And during this particular escapade into the water, the ship was strafed repeatedly by a Japanese aircraft. Sheean, who was, as part of the crew, helping everyone into the boats, was hit by one of these strafing runs. He was hit by 2 bullets, but instead of deciding, well, I've been literally been shot up by a machine gun, I should probably go and lie down in a boat somewhere and fairly legitimately hope to be taken to safety, he instead did a very Australian thing, which is he got incredibly irritated with the Japanese aircraft that had had the temerity to shoot at him. And so instead of as I said, climbing into a lifeboat, he decided that he was going to go back aboard the ship, which at this point was at something of an increasingly worrying list, strap himself in to one of the 20mm anti-aircraft cannons that was still functioning, and decided to open fire at the Japanese, who were still buzzing the sinking vessel. This had quite the effect, as previously the Japanese aircraft had been looking to finish off their kill by strafing the ship and the boats and people who are in the water, but strafing helpless sailors is one thing. Trying to do that whilst a very angry young Australian is shooting at you with the 20mm cannon is quite something else, and they were unable to effectively attack the rest of the survivors. That in and of itself would be an incredibly brave act, regardless of whether or not you'd just been shot repeatedly by a machine gun. But not only did he do this, and actually succeed in shooting down one of the Japanese planes and probably damaging several others, he decided that as the Armidale was continuing to sink, he wasn't going to abandon his post and try and make it into the water or make it to a boat, because he knew that the minute that he did that, it was highly likely that the Japanese would recommence their attack. And so he just continued to shoot at the Japanese, even as his position was dragged underwater, with a number of survivors mentioning that they actually saw 20mm tracer fire coming out from under the water briefly after the ship disappeared underneath it, indicating that even as the ship carried him down to his ultimate doom, Sheean was still trying to protect his crew by shooting at anything that he could see. Now, quite how he didn't get a Victoria Cross at that point is, to me, a little bit odd, because what is the Victoria Cross for? It's for valour. And as I said, you would probably give some kind of medal for valour to someone who'd been shot and continue to help evacuate the ship. You would give a medal for valour for someone who returned to a sinking ship and used the remaining guns to try and protect the rest of his shipmates. You would probably give some kind of medal for valour to somebody who went down with the ship in the process of defending their shipmates when they didn't have to. For someone who voluntarily went back to the ship, strapped himself in, fired on enemy aircraft, shot some of them down, and went down with the ship specifically to enable him to continue defending his crewmates for as long as possible, after having been wounded and therefore having an entirely legitimate reason for making sure he stayed on one of the lifeboats. There's an awful lot of people, and this isn't to diminish any other winners of the Victoria Cross, but there's an awful lot of people who have won Victoria Crosses for things that are arguably somewhat less valorous than that particular set of circumstances. So, yeah, I think if they do yet another review of things, he almost certainly should be awarded such a medal. To slightly twist a quote from the great Londo Mollari of Babylon 5, when it comes our time to die, we can most of us can only hope to pass with half as much dignity as he would have had at the end. Now, as far as the Imperial Japanese Navy goes, it modelled itself in some ways relatively like the Imperial Japanese Army, but it wasn't so much flexible as much as it was a little bit more adaptable, and that is splitting hairs, I know, but you'll see what I mean. Initially, when the Japanese were still very much in their isolationist phase, most of their influence, and indeed the very start of what would later become the Imperial Japanese Navy, was based around the Dutch, who were pretty much the only people who were allowed to trade regularly with Japan before the Americans forced them to trade more openly. And at the time, the Dutch were, albeit not a first-tier maritime power, they were still definitely a relatively major maritime power, at least as far as the rest of the world was concerned, outside of Western Europe. And so, as I said, the first iterations of Japanese modern naval building were based on them. However, there was a reasonable amount of French influence, but by the time the Imperial Japanese Navy as a properly going concern got established, it was decreed that they would use the British Royal Navy as their template. However, after building up their initial sort of officer corps ranking system and quite a lot of their ships, dockyards, etc., following the Royal Navy's practices and procedures, due to the size of their economy and everything else related to their naval infrastructure as compared to their nearest rivals in places like China, they then went on a little bit of a diverted course and decided to adopt French tactics and practices, and in some cases shipbuilding practice and technique as well, in generating their fleet in the sort of 1870s, 1880s. They effectively went after the French jeune école style, which meant that for a while they were a weird hybrid of sort of a core of Royal Navy derived traditions, ranks, behaviours, etc., but with a very French style actual fleet and tactics. Then they fought the Chinese, and they discovered that the jeune école tactics didn't work quite as well as the French had thought they would, and they began to rapidly drop that in favour of adopting the British methods much more full on in terms of building up a battle line, etc., to the point that by the time you got to the Battle of Tsushima, not only did the Imperial Japanese Navy in many ways resemble the Royal Navy in miniature, but there were even quite a significant number of British observers aboard the Japanese ships during the battle, and some of the most detailed English language accounts are from those people who were basically standing there taking notes on how the Japanese Navy's mostly at this point British designed vessels performed against the mostly French derived and designed vessels of the Russian Imperial Navy. And well, it's the Battle of Tsushima, we all know how well that went. The Japanese at that point were then beginning to develop much more strongly their own traditions and infrastructure, so whereas at the Battle of Tsushima the vast majority of their important capital assets were British built, by the time you got to World War I, the Japanese had home built about half of their, at the time, modern fleet, and were rapidly transitioning away towards building everything in their own shipyards, which would then obviously continue through the latter part of World War I and into the interwar and World War II periods. So yes, the Japanese Navy flirted around a little bit with various navies, but the strongest single foreign influence that they modelled themselves on up until the point they decided to do their own thing completely was the Royal Navy. Bailey Inoraura, I think, apologies because I almost certainly got that wrong, asks, how does the Great Michael rate against the Mary Rose and other Tudor ships of the time, and how true is it that it was a precursor to the ships of the line? Now, I did cover how the Great Michael rated up against the Henry Grâce à Dieu, the English flagship of the period and built in response to its construction, in Drydock episode 67, so I won't rehash that particular part of things, but I mean, the Great Michael was a large ship. It was considerably larger than most English capital ships at the time, albeit that they did then, obviously, as I said, go and build the Henry Grâce à Dieu even bigger, purely in response to it, because, well, that's how King showed off at the period. In terms of facing off against the Mary Rose, the Great Michael is larger, displaces more, although by the time of Mary Rose being in the classic configuration that we think of her now, wasn't that far off size-wise. Mary Rose had actually more guns, but possibly slightly fewer heavy guns and more anti-personnel guns. So, in a fight, ironically enough, the Mary Rose probably stands a reasonably decent chance, mainly on the grounds that it was, well, at least up until the point it rolled on its side and sank, reputed to be a relatively decent sailor, to the point that records of the time indicate that people had a great deal of difficulty in choosing which was the superior vessel between the much larger and more powerful Henry Grâce-à-Dieu and the Mary Rose. So with its more considerable anti-personnel battery and the fact that, well, larger long-distance cannons didn't fire particularly often or particularly accurately, I think in a one-on-one between the two, the Mary Rose has a reasonable chance of actually sailing in close enough to unleash hell with its numerous anti-personnel guns, sweep the decks and try to board. Albeit, as you might appreciate with these sort of 16th century galleons and their stupidly high castles, any kind of such enterprise would be effectively like trying to have a sword fight on the back of an elephant with somebody else who's also got a sword on the back of another slightly larger elephant. So, yeah, not exactly the world's most elegant of procedures, but never mind. In terms of it being a precursor to the ships of the line, not really, to be perfectly honest. I mean, none of the capital ships of this period can really be said to be the precursors of the ships of the line, except for the fact that they were relatively large for their time wooden warships that had broadside cannon. But broadside cannon were hardly an innovation particular to them or to their time period. It had started a little bit earlier and it would continue to develop for a little bit further on to go. The Mary Rose, the Henry Grâce-à-Dieu, the Great Michael, etc., the main reason that you can't really put them into the sort of timeline of development for ships of the line outside of they had some broadside heavy guns comes down again to those ridiculous looking castles. They were still very much designed for boarding actions. On the Great Michael, the number of marines, i.e. people who would defend the ship and board enemy vessels, vastly outnumbered the number of gunners. And there was not really any concept within either the English or Scottish fleets at the time for anything resembling a line of battle. And so the real precursors of the ship of the line in terms of vessels designed to fight as a vaguely homogeneous group using primarily guns as the deciding factor of war, is probably you're looking at something like the race-built galleons of the mid to late Elizabethan era, which is still half a century away at the point that the Great Michael is constructed. So, yeah, I mean, the Great Michael, the Mary Rose and the Henry Grâce-à-Dieu and all the other similar ships, they basically point to the kind of floating fortress dead end of capital ship design that would be epitomised in some ways, and possibly in some ways slightly overmuch, in the Spanish galleons of the Armada period, with the lower cut galleons of some of the English fleet and subsequently the Dutch fleet and others really being sort of a derivative from them, which was actually the ancestor of the ship of the line. Nikolai Flew asks, when did warships and submarines gain the capability of measuring depth under their keel using sonar and not using ropes and weights? The use of sound to measure depth was first pioneered by the Germans in the 1910s, ironically enough in the middle of the First World War. Well, I guess at that point they probably had a decent use for it coming up. But it wasn't made practical during that conflict. The first practical devices were manufactured in the 1920s, but first as experimental units and then later as production units. And so the installation aboard military vessels in terms of widespread use wouldn't really start until the 1930s and thereafter, albeit that obviously introduction of any kind of new technology like that is a relatively slow process, and so not all ships would have such capability at the same time, at least until, well, everyone had caught up. Lucas the Lynx asks, what was the difference between a culverin and a regular cannon in the later age of sail? Effectively, a culverin was in some ways kind of the precursor to trying to develop a high velocity, long barrel naval gun as opposed to going for just flat out bigger naval guns. And that's because compared to a regular cannon, a Culverin had a longer barrel, considerably longer in most cases, but a smaller bore, so it would fire a higher velocity but lower weight shot at obviously relatively high speeds and therefore on a flatter trajectory than the average cannon. In this particular case, these are two guns recovered from the Mary Rose. The one in the front is a Culverin, and the one at the back is a wrought iron cannon. And although in this case the cannon is almost as long as the Culverin, it's not quite. But you can also see that, hopefully even in this picture, that the bore diameter of the bronze Culverin at the front is actually significantly smaller than that of the slightly shorter cannon at the back, which kind of makes the point. So the Culverin was designed with the idea of trying not so much to get penetration, because against most wooden ships that wasn't really so much of a problem. It was more about trying to get range and also accuracy at range, because the lower velocity, higher shot weight cannons, A, wouldn't shoot as far, and B, when they did, there was a fair amount of drop. Whereas using something like a Culverin, you could achieve a longer range, which in theory would allow you to hit targets at a range that a cannon either couldn't reach or couldn't hit accurately at. And whilst this did start to drop off fairly rapidly in shipping, due to the fact that most Culverin shot weights were still relatively low, and the sides of wooden warships, especially the ships of the line, could get to a point where they could protect themselves from Culverin weight shot at long distance, but not so much from something like a 24 or 32 pounder cannon. On land, where targets were considerably squishier and less well built than a ship of the line, Culverins did hang around a lot longer because the range advantage was still there and quite useful without the necessity of having to worry about damage done, because let's face it, at the end of the day, if you get hit by a 32-pound cannon shot travelling at several hundred metres per second, you're probably about as dead as you are if you get hit by a 10-pound Culverin shot that was travelling 30% faster. About the only difference it might make is just quite how far the various bits of you go. Daniel Ziegler asks, what is your most hated conspiracy theory, myth, urban legend, etc. concerning naval history, or one that's done the most harm? Well, picking a top one is going to be very difficult, so I'll give you a small selection of the ones that really make my blood boil when I see them. Two that come from the Battle of Jutland is the idea that the Royal Navy couldn't shoot straight, and that the Royal Navy's ships, especially the battle cruisers, were poorly armoured. In both cases, easy tropes and memes to make, but actually not true in the slightest. British battlecruiser gunnery, as I've mentioned in previous Drydocks, was awful, but actually 5th Battle Squadron and Grand Fleet gunnery was superior to the gunnery of the High Seas Fleet and the battlecruiser fleet, and that's provable by any decent analysis of Jutland. And likewise with the battlecruiser armouring, no, the British battlecruisers, at least the Lion class and its derivatives, were not poorly armoured. Their armour scheme actually stood up pretty well. In many cases, the actual armour scheme stood up significantly better than the German battlecruisers because of the disparity between firepower and armour protection that was present in the two separate design lineages. The one set of ships that were poorly armoured were the Invincible class and its derivatives. That much is true, albeit that only contributed to the loss of one of them. The main contributing factor to the loss of Invincible and Queen Mary, as well as a number of other ships, was poor ammunition handling and slightly less than optimal choices of propellant. This latter one especially does get on my nerves because it then gets brought up as some kind of continuation factor of somehow lessons weren't learned with the destruction of the Hood, because, again, Hood's destruction was, as far as I can tell, and as far as will be covered in an upcoming video at some point later this year, not really anything to do with its main belt armour or its deck armour, both of which are usually the pop culture go-tos as to why the Hood exploded. Other ones that really get on my nerves are, the American government knew about and allowed the Pearl Harbor attacks to be done by the Japanese just to get into the war. There are a lot of easier ways of getting involved in World War II. And quite frankly, if your idea of let's get involved in World War II by letting somebody blow up a significant part of what at the time we believed to be our primary striking power, that doesn't work. It just flat out, I mean, never mind the, well, not even effectively, the literally treasonous nature of that kind of thing, if you were going to allow Pearl Harbor to attack, if you had previous knowledge of it. It's a thoroughly stupid way of going about things, and people who were that stupid would have also managed to somehow lose the war despite being in charge of America, and the fact that America didn't lose when it fought Japan rather speaks to the fact that, well, the people weren't mouth-breathing morons. The other one that gets me quite a lot is the fact that, well, at least as far as the general internet is concerned, the German ships, particularly those of the Kriegsmarine, appear to be one of two extremes, if you believe the most common postings. They're either sort of complete uber ships that could only be taken down by cheating and mass numbers, or else they're basic tier trash that got lucky. Neither of which is true, and if you read like any decent naval research book or historical book published by a good naval historian, I mean, the Battleship Bismarck book recently published by three very prominent naval historians is a good example of that. Any decent naval book will point out that, like pretty much everybody else, the German ships had their strengths, they had their weaknesses, and some of those weaknesses were ones that the Allies and even the Japanese didn't actually have, neither did the Italians, because of their greater experience with continuous ship design. So yeah, they made mistakes, there were problems. That doesn't mean the ship sucked. It just means they weren't as good as they could have been, but you can apply that equally across the board to all sorts of designs. Shockingly enough, it turns out that, as with everybody else, the Germans designed ships that, at the end of the day, had a degree of balance to them. Yes, the Bismarck class was incredibly inefficient for its size and displacement. That doesn't mean it was a terrible warship, it just means it could have been better. The Scharnhorst class were pretty nice designs, but suffered from being extremely wet and had a rather anemic armament, albeit they were planned to be upgraded, and so on and so on and so forth down the line. But at the same time, you can point all sorts of similar things out with other nations' designs. For example, say the North Carolinas, nicely armed. For the first couple of years, they couldn't move particularly quickly, and their armour scheme's not fantastic. Look at the King George V. Good armour scheme, can actually move at a decent clip. Would have probably been much better with the 3 triple 15-inch turrets that were originally considered, and also actually having anti-aircraft fire control systems and ammunition that worked in the tropical environment for the first few years of the war. His Lordship asks, what is the story of the last successful opposed boarding action of a warship at sea, not counting the occasional occupation of a forced-to-surface U-boat, and when did navies stop training their regular ship crewmen to undertake boarding actions, as opposed to ships hosting specialist marines or SEAL types? So if you're excluding U-boats and we're talking about opposed boarding actions, i.e. where the crew actually fights back to try and retain their ship, and we're also talking about warships or ships in the service of a navy, then it's probably a toss-up between various small boarding actions that were fought in the English Channel and the North Sea between the German and British coastal flotillas, things like E-boats or S-boats, depending on how you like to pronounce them, and the MTBs and MGBs of the Royal Navy. For larger ships, you're probably looking at something like maybe the Altmark incident, since the German crew of the Altmark did try to resist the boarding parties of HMS Cossack. But beyond that, there's very little in terms of opposed boarding actions that don't involve U-boats from that period, and precious little still thereafter. And that kind of relates to when navies stopped training their crewmen to undertake or indeed resist boarding actions. And it basically comes about due to the increasing prevalence of automatic weapons. Crewmen were still being drilled in cutlass and bayonet drill into the early 1900s. Indeed, there are many, well, not many, but there are some pictures of various ships' crews undergoing cutlass, bayonet, or rifle drill on the decks of their ships in the time period of the run-up to, and even in some cases during World War One. But this kind of drill seems to have died off during and shortly after World War One. So in different navies, it will have stopped at different times. But generally speaking, by the time you get to sort of the mid-interwar period and into World War Two, although ship's crew would still be expected to fight, there wasn't a tremendous amount of dedicated training for boarding actions and the like. Hence why you get some of the rather more comical melee actions that occasionally pop up in World War II, where everyone is willing to help, but not everybody has what you would otherwise classify as a proper weapon in order to do so. Nathan Huey asks, alternative history question, how might the Pacific theatre have unfolded if, say in 1936, the USA had stolen plans for the Type 93 Long Lance, whilst the Imperial Japanese Navy had simultaneously managed to acquire plans for the 20mm Oerlikon and 40mm Bofors? This particular trade favours the Japanese Navy a little bit more than the US Navy. Now, you might think on the face of it that seems a bit absurd, considering that, well, the Japanese already had some form of anti-aircraft defence, whereas the US Navy might as well have not had a torpedo for the first couple of years of the war. But the Long Lance Type 93 in particular is a 24-inch torpedo. Now, even assuming that Bjord realises what it's got in terms of the propulsion mechanism and fuel plans, the simple fact of the matter is the US Navy doesn't have, at this point, 24-inch torpedo tubes on its submarines or on its destroyers. And you're not carrying a 24-inch torpedo on an aircraft anytime soon, which makes it somewhat less useful. Now, if we're talking about a situation where Bjord actually does its job for a change and they are willing to produce a Americanized version of something that they've captured, plans for a much better thing for them to have captured would be the Type 95 torpedo. And that was effectively a 21-inch derivative of the Type 93 Long Lance, which was then used in Japanese submarines. Now, that would give the US a huge advantage, because now they have not only a working torpedo, but also a working torpedo that's significantly longer range and quite a bit quicker than a Mark 14, even on its good days. So, yeah, slight modification there, but would be incredibly useful if it was a Type 95, less so if it's a Type 93. With the Imperial Japanese Navy, their main problem with the plans for the Oerlikon and Bofors would be production. Now, they were able to churn out a fairly scary number of 25mm guns, but getting the production up with enough numbers in, 5 or so years from plans to building, testing, development, installation, mass production it's going to take them. It's going to be a little bit of a while to get that sorted. If they do get it sorted, if they're able to produce them in the kind of numbers they did produce the 25mm in, then that makes life a lot harder for the US Navy, particularly the Bofors. With the 20mm Oerlikons, it'll increase casualties, but it's less likely to decrease the Japanese Navy's losses. And this was one of the reasons why the Oerlikon started to be supplanted by the Bofors during the war. It's because it was found that the Oerlikon's general effective engagement range turned out to be roughly contemporaneous with when various aircraft were releasing their weapons and not before that, whereas the Bofors could reach out to past where the aircraft was dropping its bomb or torpedo and shoot them down before the weapons release occurred. So it depends which of the two they adopt. Say a mass deployment of Oerlikons, the US Navy will lose a lot more aircraft, but the Japanese are probably still going to lose roughly the same amount of ships in given engagements. Whereas if they go with the Bofors, then things get a lot nastier. But that said, at the end of the day, we are looking at a situation where at that point both sides have the Oerlikons and the Bofors, and the US Navy can produce a lot more aircraft and train a lot more pilots. So in the end, they're probably going to come out on top, as they historically did. And if they do have copies of the Type 95 sitting in their torpedo tubes come December 7th, 1941, well, let's just say a lot of those Oerlikons and Bofors might end up on the ocean floor before they get the chance to so much as send a single shell down range at an American aircraft. Cicero asks, do you think the Atlanta class was a good investment of resources for the US Navy, since it never really functioned that well in its intended role, but did work well as an anti-aircraft cruiser? And if you don't think they should have been built, what would you replace them with? So the Atlanta class, as originally designed, was very much in the mould of the Omaha class cruisers from just after the end of the First World War, in as much as they were supposed to be scouts and flotilla leaders for destroyers. That didn't really work out so well. The only time the US Navy tried to use Atlantas in surface combat, they ended up getting sunk, because it turns out something that has not that much more protection than a destroyer, but is a much bigger target, tends to get chewed up very easily. Now, they did serve relatively well as anti-aircraft cruisers, but even in that role, with the advancing of technology, they had a lot of problems with top weight, to the point that later versions, sometimes called the Oakland subclass, had to actually remove 2 of the 5-inch 38 mounts just to stop them rolling over. Now, as such, I don't think they were the world's best investment of resources for the US Navy. Personally, they could have done better. Now, in terms of what they could have done better, it depends entirely on what it is they are aiming for. If they want to try and replace it with another form of light cruiser, I don't think there's that much that would reasonably be said to be a good replacement, because the existing classes of light cruisers the US Navy are building at that point are all much larger than the Atlanta. So I don't think that's really on the cards, because it's just going to be more expensive and you're getting just another light cruiser. The US Navy has a fair number of them. In terms of what I personally think they should have replaced them with or built instead of, if you're looking for something that's a flotilla leader but also has relatively decent anti-aircraft capability, I actually think that some marginally enlarged and modified version of the Summers class destroyers would actually be a good bet, because the Summers class originally come with 4 of the dual purpose twin 5-inch 38 mounts, which gives them an armament exactly half that of an original Atlanta, except that if you get 2 of them, all their guns are on the centerline, so you actually get an extra turret or mount facing the enemy, which is always good. And there's 2 targets, which means you can lose one and you've still got the other one afloat. Cost-wise, a Summers, even allowing for a bit of inflation and modification, comes in at under 50% the cost of an Atlanta, so you can get 2 Summers plus change, or 2 modified Summers plus change, for the price of a single Atlanta. You also save about 75 to 80 personnel in terms of crew. So you're not actually increasing your crew budget, you're actually decreasing your crew budget. And as destroyers, they're not that much shorter range than Atlanta. They're obviously much better able to operate with destroyers. That kind of is going to be pretty nasty to face off against, so they work very well as flotilla leaders. And, well, it's the 5-inch 38, so it's going to make a decent anti-aircraft mounting as well. This is one of the main modifications you'd make, because the Porters and Summers as built only had surface action twin mounts, so the main modification will be making sure you use the dual-purpose mount. So, yeah, going with a run of those, probably get a couple of dozen built, and that's the other thing, relatively quickly. You can turn those out faster than you can turn out Atlantas. So you'd end up with more destroyers with heavy armament. So in surface actions, they can throw down more shells. They're harder to hit, and they also have torpedoes. Probably can send out, even if you eliminate one of the mounts, you're still going to be sending out more torpedoes than an Atlanta can per side. It costs less to lose, it costs you less in personnel, and it costs you less in money. So on a sort of class building scale, you can even afford to get more than a 2-to-1 exchange rate of modified Summers for Atlantas. Earl Alexander Lucky asks, what would be the results if the 4 Iowa-class battleships, as upgraded in the 1980s, were sent back to 1941, with 2 in the Pacific and the other 2 in the Atlantic? Well, assuming that they get sent back with the crews who know how to man them and use their weapon systems, etc., they're not that much heavily modified compared to the 1941 variants. Well, fair enough, they're still being built in 1941, but you get the idea. They've got more modern radar, yes, great, but the US Navy back in 1940s had a radar advantage anyway. The main thing is going to be, well, they're going to be a bit easier to defend from air attack thanks to having CIWS systems aboard, but they're also going to primarily be useful through the fact they're carrying the Harpoon and Tomahawk missiles. Now, if they're carrying the naval Tomahawk missiles, it just gets silly, so we're going to assume that they're carrying the land attack versions, which they historically most likely were, given that they were also fitted with Harpoons. Now, between their UAVs and the Harpoons, that does make taking out some ships a bit easier, because they can use either reports from aerial spotting or the UAVs themselves to find Japanese ships beyond anyone's gun range and send a Harpoon or 2 downrange to cripple or destroy it, and then follow it up with guns. So that'll increase their kill ratios a little bit. But the main thing is the Tomahawks, because if they can target the Tomahawks, well, even assuming they're not carrying any reloads, you're still talking about 128 precision attack munitions, which are relatively unlikely to fail and also very unlikely to be shot down. So in the Pacific, they'll probably be used against point targets during the advance through various parts of the Japanese-held islands. Might be used against something like, say, a major factory in Japan, or maybe the anchorages at, say, somewhere like Truk, if they know that a particular ship is in a particular location, albeit it's going to be a little bit less precise, since obviously GPS doesn't exist in 1941. They're going to have to rely on inertial guidance only. But the 2 in the Atlantic are going to be far, far, far more useful, because there's a lot of very, very, very nice juicy point targets in the form of certain key German factories, oil refineries in places like Romania, and fairly important targets like, say, something like Tirpitz, where the location is fairly well known. And I have a feeling that that would be where the modernised Iowas would see their most critical use. It would be basically using their Tomahawks to snipe off key targets. And then once they run out, well, it's an Iowa-class battleship with somewhat better radar and some Harpoons, so they're going to just be even deadlier surface combatants than they already were. Leops 1984 asks, your thoughts on Admiral Kimmel at Pearl Harbor? Was he unfairly blamed for systemic errors, or did he make incorrect decisions that were blameworthy? I think Admiral Kimmel generally got a little bit of the short end of the stick when it came to his treatment post-Pearl Harbor. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, he was the commanding officer, and the attack on Pearl Harbor happened on his watch, and the buck does stop with the commanding officer. So, in as much as that respect is concerned, it was right that he was put under scrutiny for his preparations, or lack thereof, at Pearl Harbor. However, the extent to which he was made the scapegoat, and the fact that he was charged with everything up to and including dereliction of duty, is, I think, far, far too harsh. He did what he could, given the circumstances, funding, and willingness to act from on high that were available to him, in most respects. So I think that shows that he was trying to do his best, and he was actually planning counterstrikes and such like during the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor. They got pulled back by slightly more conservative admirals who came in to replace him shortly after the attacks had concluded. But I think when you look at the various sources that deride him and the others that defend him, the pattern that I've noticed is that the officers who knew him best, the officers who served with him, or the officers who had worked with him, or otherwise had a reasonably good relationship with him, tended to be the ones who are defending him. And the further and further away you get from the actual man, and the more you get into sort of the rarefied aspects of academia where you don't actually ever meet the person, or even the people who worked with him, particularly you just look at documentation and such like, which obviously is by its very nature somewhat fragmentary, that's where you start to see more and more people deriding him. And also in the political circles, because of course politicians can't possibly be responsible for anything that goes wrong ever. Now, with that said, did he make mistakes? Yes, he did. The three main things that you could hold against him was that, one, he didn't work particularly well with the army, who were supposed to be looking after Pearl Harbor itself, the actual fleet and port aspect of things. That's a professional failing. If he had a better working relationship, then perhaps things might have changed. Then you've also got the fact that when US intelligence lost track of the US carriers, granted he didn't have that many recon assets to hand, but he probably should have focused any and all available naval and airborne assets to try and find out where the heck they'd gone, which might have found them. It might not. It might still have resulted in the same attack, but the simple fact of actually looking would have been a better course of action than the one that he did take. And then finally, there's the probably the most tenuous of them, which is that when he was ordered to put the fleet on a defensive deployment, he, for some reason, thought that the main threat was Japanese sabotage in Hawaii. I guess people really did think there was a fifth column of Japanese Americans around at the time, but never mind. So yes, he could have had the fleet on slightly higher alert. He could have looked a little bit harder for the Japanese carriers, and putting those two together, if he had a better working relationship with the army, then if he was looking for the carriers and he couldn't find them, and the fleet was on the defensive, he might have, say, asked the army to have a bunch of US Army Air Force fighters patrolling in and around the area, which might have A, spotted, and B, intercepted the Japanese attacks, which might have again reduced their effectiveness. However, the flip side to all of that, one of the things that probably bears mentioning in all of this is that a lot is made about the fact that the US carriers weren't present, and that was very fortunate. Yes, it was, but it wasn't a matter of pure luck. That was actually down to Kimmel, albeit not intentionally. He didn't send them away knowing that there was going to be an attack. What he did do was he was trying to reinforce forward American positions at places like Wake Island and Midway. The carriers were on their way to deploy further reinforcements in terms of supplies and aircraft to those places when the Japanese showed up. If Kimmel had been completely lackadaisical and just sort of sat pretty in Pearl Harbor, he wouldn't have initiated those reinforcement measures, which would have meant that at least Enterprise and Lexington would have been tied up in port right alongside, well, not literally alongside, but you get the idea, the battleships. And can you imagine the utter disaster that would have been visited upon the US Navy if two of its main fleet carriers had been blown out of the water at Pearl Harbor, as well as all the battleships? So yeah, as I say, he made mistakes. Some of them rightly should be pulled up as failings, but he didn't mess up quite as badly as some people would like to have you believe. Tom Harper 1997 asks, what's the shortest range gunfight between two enemy warships post-World War I after line tactics were utilised less, and how rare were very close range by modern standards encounters post-World War I? Surprisingly, close range encounters weren't actually that rare during World War II. Some capital ship battles did get down to what for capital ships were stupidly close range, albeit that in both of the most obvious cases, it wasn't so much a slugging match as more of a one-sided execution. That being Rodney versus Bismarck, because Rodney probably close to about the closest a capital ship closed on another one in combat during the Second World War, getting down to about 3,000 yards away from Bismarck, which is, in battleship terms, effectively resting your gun barrel against the head of the enemy captain. And Washington versus Kirishima was about 5,000 yards, which is maybe the equivalent of a finger's breadth away from the temple of the enemy captain. But in both of those cases, the other side wasn't really in a position to fire back. Bismarck because it had already been battered into a blazing wreck, and Kirishima because it was looking at South Dakota, which, incidentally, it had also engaged at roughly down to the range of about 5,000 yards. So, yeah, you and of course you've got things like Battle of Cape Matapan. Again, very close range fight. Then you've got, beyond that, a whole series of fights that will get even closer. So for capital ship engagements, you're probably looking at those two, the last Battle of Kirishima and the last Battle of Bismarck. For shortest range gunfight between warships, assuming we take a warship as something that's destroyer-sized and up, there'll be any number of encounters in the Eastern Atlantic, North Sea, English Channel, as well as in the Pacific at places like Savo Island, Guadalcanal, etc., where ships were either deliberately or accidentally almost ramming each other, and the action would get right up in very, very close and personal, to the point that the anti-aircraft weaponry of ships, down to machine guns, could become a factor in what they were shooting at the enemy. So, shortest range gunfight, impossible to tell really, because how close is close? When you're shaving paint off your enemy with machine gun fire, you're about as close as it's going to get, and that happened on multiple occasions. So yeah, the most common circumstance where that happened, unsurprisingly enough, was night battles. Daytime battles tended generally to take place at slightly longer ranges because everybody tried to shoot at each other when they could see each other, which, shockingly enough, during the daytime is significantly further away. Brett McDowell asks, what is your opinion of Admiral Nimitz in your ranking of World War II admirals? He says, I may have missed it, but I've never heard you mention him when you list off admirals as either good or bad when asked previously. Well, in terms of how effective or not Nimitz was, there's a good reason that there's an entire class of nuclear-powered supercarrier named after him. The reason I've not particularly mentioned him when listing admirals in the good or bad category before is not so much because he wasn't a good admiral, he definitely was, but because he falls into that rather interesting rank of very highly placed admirals who made some of the toughest and perhaps most critical decisions of the war, but also are much harder to gauge on a sort of a basic ranking of who's best and who's worst, because due to their high rank, they're not actually out there on the front lines. So you can look at admirals like Fletcher, Halsey, Spruance, Cunningham, Somerville, Tovey, etc., in the Allied side, and many, obviously, others on the Axis side as well. And these admirals were actually on ships, they were commanding their ships in battle, and so it's relatively easy to point to this admiral in command of this ship or formation made these mistakes or did these things correctly, etc. But when you get up to the level of Nimitz, they're not out doing that. They're making the decisions that are sending those other admirals out into those conflicts. So, for example, if you look at, say, the conduct of American ships at the battles of Coral Sea and Midway, it's much easier to focus on the actions of the admirals in command of the US ships actually present at that battle and how they directed their ships in the battle itself, because at the end of the day, that is how the battles are decided. But at the same time, the hand of Admiral Nimitz was behind both of those battles, because through a combination of strategic decision-making and obviously having access to the signals intelligence, he was the one who directed the US forces to be there in the first place. So to look at someone like Admiral Raeder, Admiral Dönitz, Admiral Pound, and Admiral Nimitz, and even to an extent Admiral Yamamoto, it's a lot more of a complex situation, because the admirals on the front lines, they generally have a set criteria of information with which to work going into the battle, plus whatever they find out during the battle. Whereas these higher-ranking admirals have so many more lines of inquiry and information that they have to work with, that to try and work out whether or not they use them all well and properly, whether they missed something, etc., is a vastly more complicated task. But there's a very long way of saying that my general opinion of Admiral Nimitz is that he in terms of the upper-ranking strategic admirals, he definitely merits a place in the top 3. I don't know exactly what the top 3 is, but he's definitely in there. Apart from anything else, he was either lucky or skillful enough to have made, relatively speaking, the fewest mistakes. For example, his approximate counterpart, Admiral Pound in the Royal Navy, made a number of good decisions, but also made a number of fairly significant errors. Admiral Raeder and this obviously Admiral Dönitz as well. Well, they did lose. Not that they could have done an awful lot about it, but again, they did make a number of fairly significant mistakes. And well, Admiral Yamamoto, that's a whole other saga. But apart from anything else, not quite realizing after quite a number of clues were in place that your code signals were being read, and then getting yourself shot down. That's a fairly significant mark against that none of the others quite managed to equal. NCC8472 asks, what kind of food or meals did the sailors in the various major navies in World War II eat whilst they were at sea? Were there cultural differences? Was there some kind of universal ration standard? And were meals served during extended periods of combat? So, way back in Drydock episode 36, I talked a bit about the meals that you might expect to find aboard a Royal Navy ship, but this is more about the General Navy case. So, generally speaking, aboard ships, you could expect a slightly better quality of food than if you were serving in something like, say, the Army, because at the end of the day, if you were aboard a ship, the ship had the facilities to cook food in some way, shape or form. Obviously, aboard a submarine or a destroyer, the facilities would be somewhat more limited than aboard a carrier or a battleship, but there would always be some form of food cooking facility. And if there wasn't, that usually meant that your ship had sunk and you had more important things to worry about than where your next hot meal was coming from. Now, with that said, the rations or the meals that were served basically had to fulfill a number of criteria. So they had to give you as many calories as they possibly could, because you need a lot of calories for the kind of high intensity, high energy activities you'll be taking part in. They also need to be stored as efficiently as possible, because there is a limited amount of space aboard a ship of any size, and if you're going to be operating away from port for weeks or months at a time, and there's a lot of people to feed, you can't go with sort of inefficiently stored food. So powdered food or grained food was very popular, or stuff that just came in big solid masses with minimal to no throwaway. You also had to make sure the food would last as long as possible. A ship is not necessarily the healthiest of environments to store food in. I mean, if you're serving in the Arctic, then the whole place is probably going to be freezing, which is great as far as preserving food goes. But anywhere else, there is going to be damp, there's going to be moisture, there's going to be, especially if you're serving the Pacific regions around the equator, or in the Mediterranean, there's going to be a lot of heat, there's going to be temperature fluctuations and changes. None of this is good for storing food. There will be some limited refrigeration, of course, but you're not on a refrigeration ship, you're on a warship, and space and energy are at a premium. And then, of course, you have the fact that in most navies there's also the lowest price denominator, which you may not appreciate as much as the bean counters back at home do. As a result, each navy was different. There wasn't a kind of standard ration. Apart from anything else, there's the culinary tastes of each individual ship, and the crews from different countries to take account for. But there would be some commonality to the type, if not necessarily the exact nature of the food. So storing food in, as I said, in grain form, stuff like rice or flour, which is obviously a ground grain, was quite popular because it's very compact, very easy to store, minimal wasted space, relatively easy to preserve from the various elements that we described earlier as compared to something like bread, and can then be prepared fresh, which is, again, always a perk. Fresh bread being considerably nicer than something that's sat in a damp corner somewhere for 2 or 3 weeks. You've also got stuff that can be reconstituted. Powdered milk, for example. Again, stores relatively compact. Might not taste brilliant, but you can extract water from the ocean, or use existing water supplies to constitute it back up into something that's a little bit more palatable. Biscuits, meat, if it was either salted and dried, or if it was in the limited amount of frozen and cold storage. And vegetables, even in the World War II period, the fresh ones would be exhausted pretty quickly after you left port. So if you were going to have vegetables, they would be more of the sort of freeze-dried or otherwise preserved variety, which, again, not the most appetizing of things. And as we said, cultural values as well. So if you were on a British ship, you could expect food supplies to tend towards things that could be roasted, boiled, or have gravy poured over them. American supplies tended to trend a little bit more towards stuff that could be fried. Japanese supplies tended to consist of vast quantities of rice above all else. And no, that's not a racial stereotype. That is literally pretty much the vast bulk of their diets. When it came to shipborne rations. Germans, shockingly enough, would find significant amounts of cabbage and sausage in their diet as opposed to other possible options. And then, of course, there was also culture and how much food your home nation actually had. So between the various Allied efforts to interdict Japan's food supply, the Japanese rations, which weren't particularly generous to start with, dropped quite significantly in calorific value and also actual size during the war. The German rations took a bit of a hit, but at the end of the day, they do try and everyone tries to keep their military up and running during a war as best as possible. The Americans, who suffered not from much in the way of food shortages, could afford to go a little bit more esoteric with some of their luxuries, such as ice cream, with, as some of you may well be aware, entire ships dedicated to making ice cream wandering around the Pacific. And in the Royal Navy, whereas ice cream might be viewed as an absolutely hideous waste of time and far too much of a luxury, you couldn't possibly do away with the rum ration. That way lies mutiny and madness. Whereas on American ships, whilst a significant amount of alcohol that was not fulfilling its patriotic duty stored away in warehouses was liberated and taken aboard ships, it was very much a covert operation and strictly not to regulation. And as I mentioned in other dry docks, that did kind of lead to, when Allied warships would meet up, there would be certain, shall we say, cultural exchanges in the form of rum and beer and ice cream, and if the French were involved, wine, because of course. And finally, of course, everything did, to a certain degree, depend on the skill of the ship's cooks. If you didn't have a particularly skilled ship's cook, it would be, it's what it says on the tin. It goes in that corner of your plate. Have fun. Whereas if you had someone who was either skilled or inventive, or possibly both, you could end up with some fairly complex and interesting dishes being served, to the point that you might actually end up thinking, not only is the calorific intake better than what I'm getting at home, but possibly even the food preparation and quality is better than what I get at home. Obviously for a given value of home, but some Navy chefs are pretty good at what they do, especially given the ingredients they're usually given. George Armates asks, I was reading the entry on Wikipedia for Operation Zitronella, that's the bombardment of Spitsbergen, when I came across this excerpt. A German leading seaman from a destroyer was court-martialed and sentenced to death for cowardice, as he had hidden on his ship rather than accompanying troops to the shore, and was executed on the quarterdeck of Scharnhorst. This episode, along with the dispute over medal allocation when the crew of Scharnhorst received only 160 Iron Crosses against 400 for the crew of Tirpitz, exacerbated an already bad relationship between the crews. So, why did the crews of Scharnhorst and Tirpitz have bad relations before this event? So this took a little bit of digging, as I unfortunately don't have the book that particular quote is extracted from. But I did do some reading around other bits and pieces, and it's not the easiest of things to look for. I'd certainly not heard of this before, but I did manage to put together a few clues and can perhaps link that together with some speculation. So obviously, as mentioned, there is the instance of the fact that the Scharnhorst crew felt shortchanged compared to Tirpitz's crew. But the seamen being executed, this was a poorly received thing on behalf of the Scharnhorst crew for a number of reasons. Firstly was the fact that Tirpitz was the flagship of the Spitsbergen operation, and so if someone was going to be executed for failing their part in fulfilling their duties during that operation, then by all rights they should be executed on the flagship. And Scharnhorst was simply just told, well, you're going to do it there because reasons. And the crew felt that executing somebody on their own ship might bring them a significant amount of bad luck. And they also kind of felt that they were being forced to do Tirpitz's quote-unquote dirty work, i.e. the Tirpitz could maintain its whatever luck it had, it could remain the nice clean flagship, but it was just getting its smaller cousin to do all the nasty stuff that, by any rights, it should have taken as its role as the flagship of the fleet. There's also some indication in other sources that part of this resentment may have risen simply from the combat histories of the ships versus their current roles. So Scharnhorst, obviously being the smaller and less heavily armed of the ships, was subordinate to Tirpitz in the German Kriegsmarine fleet up in Norway, but this appears to have led at least some of the Tirpitz's crew to assume that just because their ship was bigger and in charge, that they therefore were better. Whereas Scharnhorst crew, albeit that they largely weren't the same crew that had gone out on the various Atlantic and Norwegian expeditions in the early part of the war, since most of them had been distributed to other parts of the Kriegsmarine during Scharnhorst's enforced stay in Brest, the Scharnhorst crew still felt that their ship was by far the more experienced, by far the more, much more of a combat veteran, and therefore had been a lot more useful to the fatherland, and was generally therefore a better ship than effectively what they viewed as a green vessel that hadn't really accomplished much, but was now trying to lord it over them simply because it had bigger guns than they did. And when you get this on sort of close confined quarters in a cold Norwegian fjord, the slightest slight or hint of a slight or perceived slight can end up exacerbating this on a fairly large scale. So that's, as far as I've been able to find, potential sort of long-term causes of a bad relationship between the two ships' crews. If anybody else knows more, please feel free to share below, because I have a feeling that this kind of detail is probably available in much greater concentrations in some German documents or books that probably haven't seen an English translation yet. Paul from Chicago asks, did the hallway behind the casemates on armoured cruisers also exist on pre-dreadnoughts? And how much did this design defect contribute to the loss by flash or flood of the 3 armoured cruisers at Jutland? So, the supply passageway in question, yes, it existed on pre-dreadnoughts, it existed on armoured cruisers, it existed in dreadnoughts as well. Although in most navies the individual casement guns were in their own little gun bays, the simple fact of the matter was that behind and below them were usually the ship's engines, which was not somewhere you particularly wanted to store ammunition, even if there was the space for it. And so in most ships of this period with casement batteries, you would have usually 2 magazines, possibly occasionally more, and they'd be positioned relatively near the main magazines. Now, that's all well and good if you're in a casement gun that's adjacent to or just nearby one of the main battery guns, but it's not so good if you're, say, completely amidships. You're about as far away from those magazines as it's possible to get, and no one's going to set up some kind of labyrinthine ammunition supply system running below the decks. And so this ammunition passage behind the gun bays was implemented, the idea being that you would hoist up the shells and charges, if necessary, from the magazines, and then these would be transported down the hallways to the various guns, whereupon obviously they'd be loaded and fired, which was, in theory, a properly working policy. The problem was that, as you might imagine, if you've got a battery of half a dozen or more casement guns and you've got a single hoist just gently sculling shells down the corridor, that is going to rather complicate your ability to fire shells rapidly, because that one hoist and line system has to serve every gun on that side of the ship. And so people would stack ammunition within the gun bays more than just the ready use ammunition that they were supposed to. It's a design defect in a way, but it's not one that's really that easy to get around. The only other solution would be to, as mentioned, basically have individual magazines and individual hoists for every single casement gun, which is wildly impractical in terms of weight and space usage. And so it was an existing weakness. The gun bays themselves were generally armoured, usually sort of 1 to 2 inch bulkheads, so the explosion of some ammunition in any given gun bay, if it takes a direct hit, shouldn't compromise the whole ship. The problem was, as we said, because of the supply issues, if you have a lot more ammunition than you're supposed to in the casement, then that explosive pressure will obviously be significantly greater, which will blow out the gun bay, and then you have a passage that leads directly to an ammunition hoist and down to a magazine of lots of explosives, which is not a good thing. The armoured cruisers at Jutland, yes, they had their ammunition handling problems because of the slow rate of fire in those casemates. But to be perfectly honest, much like the Indefatigable, they just didn't have the armour to stand up to the weapons that were being pointed at them on the day, at which point it didn't make all that much difference whether they had ammunition in the casemates, in the passageways, or in the magazines, because the shells were going to find those piles of explosives at some point. Albeit that having a large, high-explosive firecracker trail all the way to the magazine certainly helped the German objective of sinking them. Dave Collier asks if I could tell everyone a bit about the life and achievements of Mary Lacy. Well, okay, well, I'll give a very short-potted history. The biography of Mary Lacy and a number of other women who served somewhat surreptitiously in the Navy is available online in a couple of different books. In particular, there's one called The Lady Tars, The Autobiographies of Hannah Snell, Mary Lacy and Mary Antle, but it's definitely worth a read as long as you can stand early 18th century prose. But there you go. Anyway, Mary Lacy in particular, she was a young woman who was from a poor family, but was educated in a charity school and turned out to be fairly intelligent, adopting the ability to read and learning a number of crafts fairly quickly. But apparently with something of a mischievous streak, she decided at the ripe old age of 19 that she was going to wander off down to Chatham and seek employment somewhere. As it turned out, when she arrived at Chatham, shockingly enough, being a Royal Navy dockyard, there were a few postings available for ships at sea, and she went aboard first as a gunner's mate aboard the new ship, the Sandwich. While she was aboard, it turned out that the gunner had agreed to take on an additional servant, and so she, because she was Mary Lacy, but she was going by the name William Chandler, and she was transferred over to work for the ship's carpenter. And in that guise, she fit in with all the other ship's servants and midshipmen, serving aboard the Sandwich, and then latterly aboard HMS Royal Sovereign for quite a while during one of the various conflicts with France. However, after almost half a decade spent at sea, she managed to end up with an illness that appears to be rheumatism, which forced her ashore. And in that guise, she continued to, as William Chandler, present herself as a carpenter, and she would become an apprentice at the dockyards for a considerable time beyond that. And working her way up through the ranks, she was almost discovered, but a couple of shipwrights took pity on her based on the quality of her work and covered for her, at which point she managed to get herself qualified as a fully certificated shipwright. And obviously, therefore, she could design and supervise the construction of sailing warships. Unfortunately, she would fall ill shortly thereafter and was unable to work, but as a fully qualified shipwright, and having obviously therefore contributed to the Navy, she was entitled to an Admiralty pension. William Chandler was entitled to an Admiralty pension, but it was at this point that she decided that it was time to drop the disguise, and so adopting her actual name of Mary Lacy, she applied for a pension, effectively telling the Admiralty her life story. The Admiralty was somewhat incredulous at the idea that a woman could have passed for more than a decade within the Navy without ever being discovered, but after checking with various people who had known him-her, they agreed that she should be paid a pension, and she went off and got herself married and began writing her autobiography called The Female Shipwright. Unfortunately, it's not entirely completed, and we don't exactly know what happened to her after 1773. But yes, that's a short-potted history of Mary Lacy, one of the women who's managed to serve aboard His Majesty's warships and then become a skilled shipwright of reasonable repute, unfortunately before illness forced her to retire. Manani Wanderer asks, did any other navies have their own Kamchatkas? And if so, could you elaborate on which one has the most entertaining story? Well, much as its reputation is a little bit over-exaggerated, and see the 5-minute guide on the ship in question for a bit more coverage on that, the William D. Porter of the US Navy would probably come as close as any US Navy ship to being the American version of the Kamchatka, what with nearly blowing the president out of the water, amongst various other incidents. For a brief period, HMS Canopus was probably the Kamchatka of the Royal Navy, albeit that it would redeem itself a few weeks later, but in the initial run-up to the Battle of Coronel, Canopus was a real albatross around the Royal Navy's neck, what with being physically capable of keeping up with Craddock's squadron, but not actually doing so on the grounds that the chief engineer was undergoing a complete mental breakdown and was about 2 seconds away from being completely convinced that gremlins were overrunning the engine room and that the seashells were spoke German. So, yeah. As a result, Canopus went a lot slower than it was actually capable of, and, well, Battle of Coronel, we all know what happened to Admiral Craddock's squadron, largely as a result of Canopus not being there. So, yeah, a little bit embarrassing for the Royal Navy, thanks to that particular mess-up. And for the Japanese, I think you've got to go with the cruiser Megami. It was involved in multiple collisions at various points, including a couple that probably had fairly serious consequences. In its very last battle, when it was being savaged by American ships, it ended up colliding with another Japanese ship and resulting in the loss of that. At the Battle of Midway, it ended up colliding with the Mikuma, which resulted in both of them having to break off. Mikuma was then sunk by American bombers. Megami was heavily damaged. And, of course, neither ship nor the escorts were available to try and defend the carriers from the incoming air attacks that sealed the Japanese fleet's fate at Midway. The list goes on. It's also responsible for the single worst friendly fire incident in naval history, when it launched a spread of torpedoes and managed to destroy 5 of its own fleet's transport ships. It pretty much came home battered, damaged, and near enough wrecked almost every time it went out on a major mission, so it cost a fortune to maintain. I have a feeling the Americans probably did the Japanese a favour by sinking it at Surigao Strait. I Ship You Not asks, was there a potential way of exploiting the Washington Naval Treaty without breaking it when it came to carriers? As in the treaty, Argus, Furious, Langley and Hosho were declared experimental and didn't count towards any country's displacement. Why didn't anyone consider this as a potential loophole to pack in as much punch as possible within the given limits? I.e., was there anything preventing the signatories from going full Ship of Theseus, i.e. complete rebuild, with their respective vessels as long as the ship in question didn't exceed 27,000 tons? I realise this would have cost as much as or more than a completely new carrier, but since overall displacement of these was limited, to my mind a rebuild like this might make more sense. What are your thoughts? It was a potential loophole, but to be honest, the scope for it was relatively limited for most of the ships. So for something like Argus, Langley, even Hermes, Hosho, etc., their size just wasn't anywhere close enough for any conceivably decent rebuild to bring them up to reasonable spec. And there was a certain amount of allowance for upgrades and such, but the sheer cost of effectively building a new ship that includes a few plates of the old was just purely prohibitive. Now, with something slightly larger, like, say, Furious, that may very well have been possible. So something like Furious or Eagle, they had the physical size that a few clever extensions here and there, some changes of machinery, etc., and you might have been able to engineer those into significantly more capable carriers, again, at a significant amount of cost. And at the end of the day, whilst you might have been technically correct in that's not a treaty violation, people would have cottoned on pretty quickly to what you were doing and then modified subsequent treaties to factor that in. For example, the picture that's been showing as we've been going along discussing this is Ryujo, one of the Japanese carriers, and this was a carrier explicitly built to try and take advantage of a loophole in the initial Washington Naval Treaty, which was that aircraft carriers were only classified as vessels of 10,000 tons or more. So the Japanese immediately went, aha, well, if we can build something approximating a small fleet carrier for just a fraction under 10,000 tons, it doesn't count as a carrier, and then we can build a ton of them, which will allow our air fleet to grow massively compared to everybody else's. But, well, one, it turned out it wasn't actually possible to build a semi-decent small fleet carrier on 10,000 tons, and Ryujo ended up vastly overweight. And two, everyone saw exactly what they were doing, and so by the time the London Naval Treaty rolled around, that loophole was well and truly shut. Ragin Cassian asks, I was thinking about ways to get around treaty limitations. Did anyone ever stretch a ship, i.e. cutting it in half and then adding a section? Also, how feasible would it be to build a battleship with room for 4 turrets and just leave one of them out to save displacement, dropping it in if you end up going to war? Would seakeeping - structural rigidity be affected by having a giant hole in the ship? So, stretching a ship by cutting it in half and adding a section, theoretically you could try that, but the displacement that was left for allowed for improvements, which you could technically stretch that out if you fancied not having a particularly brilliant underwater protection system, was about 3,000 tons, so you probably wouldn't get all that much out of it, especially considering that by burning all your extra displacement on that, you would end up with a ship that was less manoeuvrable, albeit possibly slightly faster and more heavily armed, but with virtually no underwater protection comparative to interwar and World War II period ships. In terms of building a ship and then just leaving a part out, again, theoretically it's possible, but more practically, well, A, everyone's going to realise what you're doing, which is similar to the last question, at which point they'll just turn around and forbid it in the next naval treaty. The other problem is weight distribution, because turrets weigh a fair bit. I mean, you're looking at the maybe 800 up to 1,500 tons, going on more than that once you get into the latter part of the 1930s. Even on a 35,000 ton ship, that is a fair chunk of displacement. It's a significant percentage, and that's just the turret. That's not including the barbette, the magazines, all the equipment, etc., which you would necessarily have to leave out in order to make it not entirely obvious. You'd basically just have to leave a skeletal frame structure inside. And that's going to affect your ship's distribution of weight and in turn its balance. And then you have a problem of either you don't compensate for the weight because you're relying on the weight being compensated for by the turret and its equipment once you need to install it, at which point the ship is either going to look somewhat like a speedboat or somewhat like a submarine trying to dive, depending on which end of the ship your empty turret is on, or empty turret space, I should say, which is A, going to give the game away a bit, and B, also look completely stupid and make you very unpopular. Whereas if you add compensatory weight in order to balance everything out, well, you've just put in the necessary weight that you would have had with the turret anyway, at which point you haven't actually saved anything because your ship still displaces as much, it's just slightly less heavily armed until such time as you decide to arm it. About the only way you might get away with it would be if you were to have a ship that was designed with a Q turret, somewhat like the 13.5-inch gun British ships or the Italian World War One dreadnoughts, or possibly the American World War One dreadnoughts of the Texas-New York class. At which point, if you didn't have that, and maybe some, I don't know, stuck a rudimentary aircraft catapult system on top as a disguise, your ship's still going to be riding relatively high, which is going to be something of a problem. But I suppose at that point you could probably flood, say, the torpedo protection spaces to weigh it back down again. But it's an awful lot of effort to go through for not a tremendous amount of result, especially considering the sheer amount of time it would take to add all those bits of equipment. You'd basically have to pull off something like what Japan did with the Hiei and store everything carefully in a warehouse, then withdraw from the treaties in preparation for war and spend a year or two re-equipping all your ships. Now, in terms of getting around the treaties in certain ways, apart from flat out lying, there were a number of ways that could be done. The Nelson class, for example, having carefully excluded certain types of water aboard the ships from accounting towards standard displacement, the Nelsons then promptly went and used one of those types as a form of armour protection within the overall protective system, thus allowing it to theoretically have much greater protection than its displacement otherwise suggested. You also had the County class, of which you can see one here, and although HMS London's refit didn't work out particularly well, that was more because the London subclass was designed with an extreme view towards weight saving. But some of the earlier Londons, although designed with box magazine protection rather than a full armoured belt, they seemed to rather suspiciously take a full-length armour belt relatively well once they were decided to equip them with it. So take that as you will. Then, of course, you've got the Japanese, albeit they did lie about the Megami class's displacement in the first place, but putting in the 6.6-inch guns with the full intention to swap them out for dual 8s at some point in the future, which, of course, they then went ahead and did. And so on and so on and so forth. One of the other favourite tricks was to design a magazine to hold significantly more ammunition and then just load it out with relatively minimal ammunition to save a few hundred tons here and there. But yeah, there's lots of little ways of getting around the treaties, but nothing massively major without flat out lying about something, which was, as we can see with Japan and Germany, always an option. Merciless Neb asks, before the Royal Navy was the predominant superpower, what civilizations would you consider to be the naval superpowers of the ancient and medieval times? Well, that title has waxed and waned over the centuries for considerable periods. I mean, the loose collection of peoples that you could vaguely describe as the Phoenicians would probably have been the earliest single dominant naval superpower. The Minoans, by any account, were fairly dominant at sea before gigantic volcanic eruption just sort of went, okay, I think your civilization's just going to end. The Carthaginians, who were an offshoot of the Phoenicians, were for a fair amount of time the naval superpower of the Western and Central Mediterranean, to the point that they were pretty much the one and only power that had a chance of challenging Rome, although that didn't end so well for them, did it? So Rome then became the naval superpower by dint of being, well, the only power because they'd occupied all the ports. In between that, you had the Persians, again, through sheer size, before the Romans and the Carthaginians. The Greeks, for a while, were a fairly powerful naval force, albeit the fact that they were all scattered into various city-states didn't help their case too much, but when they came together, they proved capable of fending off the Persian fleets on occasion, with things like the Battle of Salamis and so forth. Athens, in particular, taking a bit of a biscuit there. Then once you move past the truly ancient times, and bear in mind this is a little bit Eurocentric because, well, China is China and Japan is Japan. They had their various moments in the spotlight over that way, but things didn't change quite as much over in the, well, what for the Western world is the Far East, largely on the basis of the fact that the countries were, if not the rulers, but the countries themselves were relatively continuous. So, I mean, China was generally China, and Japan was generally Japan. So there was not a tremendous amount of back and forth as to who was the overall dominant there. As compared to somewhere like the Mediterranean or Western Europe, where people were constantly challenging every 5 to 10 years for the privilege. But once you got out of that period into the medieval period, there were a number of powers that briefly could be considered naval superpowers. You had places like Venice, for example, which had a fairly large, for its size, and elite navy, but was, because of their relatively small territorial holdings, somewhat vulnerable to single large defeats, kind of knocking them back quite a bit, which is why you had to end up with alliances such as the one that was put together for the Battle of Lepanto. Obviously, the Ottoman Navy, again by sheer size, became a naval superpower. The Spanish Navy, for a long period, especially once it absorbed the Portuguese as well, was the preeminent naval superpower in the later medieval period. The French got in the act as well at various points, albeit they didn't tend to have tremendous amounts of luck in sustaining that effort long term. The Spanish were a lot more consistent on that particular note. And then once you start to pull out of the sort of classical medieval period into that sort of intermediate period between cogs and massive castles, but before the age of sail proper, when you're talking about things like galleons and such, the Portuguese have their moment in the sun. The Dutch, of course, make a fairly good and serious challenge for being a predominant naval power. The French pop up every now and then and have periods of dominance before they end up losing some massive battle or other and having to start over from scratch again. And that was at a more sort of global level. In local areas, there were certain fleets you didn't want to cross. The Danish fleet, for example, was very strong at points. I don't think you can necessarily say the Viking fleet, because there wasn't really, for most of the period, a Viking fleet. There were lots of different Viking fleets under different commanders. But by the end of the migration period, you did start to see sort of fairly large areas dominated by single kings. For example, King Canute and his ancestors, even though Canute himself eventually fetched up in England. And later on in the sort of the beginnings of the proper age of sail, you have the Swedish Navy pop up basically out of nowhere, dominate the Baltic Sea. I hope I'm getting that right this time. And then you have Peter the Great build a Russian fleet. So these kind of things swing back and forth quite a fair bit. The main reason why these things swing back and forth so much as compared to the Royal Navy once it gets up ahead of steam and then remains dominant for several hundred years is largely down to strategic necessities. Virtually every other power we've listed was happy to be the dominant naval power. Spain needed it for shipments back from their colonies in South America and the like, but the countries themselves would generally be okay, if somewhat poorer, without being the dominant naval power, as long as they were a naval power. Whereas for England, and then later Britain and the United Kingdom, being an island, it kind of was necessary to be the dominant naval power once mass fleets got underway. Otherwise, you ended up getting invaded or having invasion threatened at you, akin to the Armada. So, yeah, strategic necessity, plus the fact, obviously, being an island, you can afford to have a slightly smaller army because you don't have a land border with a particularly aggressive and angry neighbour, at least not after the Act of Union, once that took care of the Scots for however long that's going to last. Fritz Kramer asks, what was the long-term effect of the experience of the USS Robin for Royal Navy carrier operations, especially when the British Pacific Fleet was formed? So the experiences of USS Robin, aka HMS Victorious, were many and varied, and both sides learned a fair bit from each other. In terms of the direct answer to the question, long-term effects of the experience on the Royal Navy, the main one was experience in mass flight operations especially utilising newer aircraft like the Avenger, as opposed to the albacores and swordfish that she'd sailed with. So that was quite handy. There were also a number of changes made to Victorious, various upgrades here and there, but particularly the aerodynamic rounded stern on the flight deck that had been provided and had been a feature since the first Royal Navy carriers was replaced with a slightly less aerodynamic but considerably larger rear extension, which allowed for a deck park to be used. So in terms of the British Pacific Fleet, the experience of the initial Royal Navy operations of Avenger torpedo bombers, the ability to practice operating with a deck park, and particularly the experience operating with the Americans of launching large-scale mass strikes as opposed to pinpoint precision strikes, which had previously been British practice, all stood Victorious and her crew and the other Royal Navy personnel in relatively good stead for when the British Pacific Fleet was formed. There were a number of other lessons that were learned in terms of things like crew morale, provision of ice cream, certain types of cooking, and fleet refueling, and other such methods that, although they were observed, were not immediately implemented, but would, when they were eventually implemented, be implemented somewhat faster thanks to the knowledge that had been gathered by the Victorious. Federico Bozzi asks, what were the main design inefficiencies of the Littorio class besides the torpedo protection system, and do you think it would have been possible, and if so worthwhile, to increase the number of heavy anti-aircraft turrets? Well, ironically, the two questions are tied together in as much as one of the biggest design inefficiencies, at least in my opinion, was the inclusion of the secondary battery on the Littorios of 12 6-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, because that's just silly. It takes up far too much weight and space for a secondary battery that, to be perfectly honest, never accomplished all that much of note, and wasn't really ever going to. It's just a little bit pointless. It's huge. I mean, you're talking about more firepower than most light cruisers as your secondary battery, but arrayed in such a way as to mean you only can ever bring half of it to bear. At least with the Yamatos, when the Japanese did a similar trick, at least they had the good grace to stick at least one of them on a central mounting so that it could fire in both directions. And given that given the layout of the Littorios, there certainly would have been space or room to have at least one centerline firing 666. So that in and of itself is a design inefficiency, and ties into your second question about the anti-aircraft battery. Now, whilst the 3.5-inch or 90mm anti-aircraft battery was perhaps a little bit delicate and has been described as possibly a little bit too good for the technology level of the time, it certainly would be far more useful than the 6-inch guns. And, okay, so it's a little bit small for anti-destroyer work by World War II standards, but if you can get a ton of them, well, quantity has a quality all of its own, I suppose. So, yes, I think if you want to increase the heavy anti-aircraft secondary battery, and that's probably a reasonable thing to go for, and who knows, it might even have saved the Roma. We can't say it wouldn't have. It was unlikely, but it might have done. I would say actually strip out the secondary battery entirely, or take out those 4 triple 6-inch turrets, and use the space and weight saved to significantly increase the number of 90mm mounts. You get a lot more heavy AA, which is good as a primary threat. You then have ridiculous amounts of 3.5-inch or 90mm mounts, which you can just smother incoming destroyers in, albeit, okay, fair enough, you don't have quite the same range, but hey, that's what your 15-inch guns are for. And yeah, as I say, it might have saved the Roma. In terms of other design inefficiencies, well, not that the Italians could have necessarily foreseen it at the time, but obviously with the advent of proper radar, if they'd managed to get that working, then they could have saved a bunch of weight by not having the extensive aircraft facilities they actually had historically on the stern, and they could also have possibly lowered the aft 15-inch gun somewhat. Now, if you take out the two 666-inch guns, take out the aircraft facilities, put radar on instead, and maybe move the aft 15 just a fraction further aft, you retain the good firing angles, but you save an awful lot of weight on having the extra raised barbette. So that would be a little bit of a design inefficiency that could be saved, albeit that obviously said they didn't necessarily know that radar was going to be good enough to replace aircraft spotting. So that's a little bit of a 50-50 there. The single biggest inefficiency, I think, was actually the armour scheme. There were some defects in its testing. You see the claim made that, it was designed to resist 15-inch shell fire down to 16,000 yards or something approximating that, depending on which source you're reading. And they usually cite these gunnery tests, but the gunnery tests, which I've gone over in various other videos, they were done using a smaller gun. And whilst using a smaller gun with a variant charge and a modified shell to simulate the performance of a larger gun is a valid way of doing things, if somewhat clunky, when you're assessing straight up penetration through a monolithic block of steel. When it comes to decapping, which is what this particular armour scheme was designed to do, it was supposed to have an actual decapping layer and then a thinner main belt to actually detonate the shell, as opposed to just a single massively thick belt. At that point, the actual geometry of the shell itself becomes important. A larger shell needs to have a larger space to decap, and the space in between was thoroughly inadequate for that. Now, there is a reasonable case to be made depending on, again, which source you read, but there's a fairly comprehensive book by Bascano on the Littorio class, which claims that the gap in between was filled with a concrete foam called cellulite, and that this foam provided a equivalent of a much larger gap via density. The engineer in me is somewhat questioning on that, because whilst, yes, the density would strip the cap off, the fact that the foam surrounding the shell on either side where the shell isn't burrowing through it would tend to actually keep the cap vaguely in place makes me suspect that that particular calculation may or may not be entirely accurate, but I haven't run the details myself, so although I have my suspicions, I wouldn't necessarily say that for definitive. But even if we assume the best case scenario that the cellulite did what it's claimed to do and provides the equivalent of a much larger gap, and therefore the decapping layer possibly works as intended, and the 11-inch belt on the inside can then resist a decapped shell. In order for that to happen, when you add up the necessary density of the cellulite and the density of the outer, the weight of the outer plate, which was just under 3 inches, and then you've got the inner plate, the amount of volume that's taken up by this ridiculously complicated system and the amount of weight that it adds up to is hilariously inefficient. It's one of these things of, it's a good idea, but you really, really let it run away from you. I mean, if you just take the 2.8-inch plate and slap it onto the 11-inch belt, you've got 13.8 inches, i.e. near enough 14 inches, which would make it one of the more heavily protected battleships of the period, and it's got inclined armour as well. So, I mean, people go on and on and on about the Iowa's system. That's a 12-inch inclined belt. Well, now you've got nearly 14-inch inclined belt, and you're not using the massive amounts of space that this gap and decapping belt layer all used. And then you've got to take into account the weight of the cellulite. And, okay, it's not as dense as steel, but running the basic calculations would reveal that you could probably add another inch or two of armour to the Littorios in exchange for that, cellulite, at which point you're looking at something in the order of between 15 and 16 inches of inclined belt armour, which, given the quality of Italian tourney armour as opposed to the Japanese armour, would actually make the Littorios approximately equivalent in protection to a Yamato, with just by having sort of a 15 to 16 inch thick inclined belt for roughly the same displacement. And I don't think you'll find anyone on the planet who'll argue that a 15 to 16 inch inclined belt of Italian tourney steel is going to be in any way vulnerable to practically anything other than a point blank supercharged 15 inch 42 round or 16 inch 50 round or something along those lines, or Yamato shell. But the protective abilities of that kind of thing, that kind of belt, would be vastly in excess of even what the Italians claim the Littorio's layout would have been capable of doing. And being vastly less complex, would have been much easier to maintain, much easier to repair, and taking up far less volume would have allowed the internal volume of the ships to be significantly greater, which in turn allows for more storage capacity, which you can use for all sorts of things, possibly greater range, possibly better torpedo defences, possibly all sorts of things. So yeah, the hideously complex and overly inefficient armour scheme is probably the single biggest thing that you can hold up against the Littorios. And the funny thing is, the Italian naval designers pretty much agreed with that statement, because when you look at the preliminary designs they came up with for the Littorio successors, they ditched the whole thing and went with a monolithic belt, which is pretty much what I spent the last few minutes describing. So yeah, even the Italians realised that that was a bad idea in the end. Memori asks, what do you think is the best way for a smaller navy to challenge a larger one around World War I and World War II? The Jeu d'école failed, unrestricted submarine warfare tended to annoy everybody, and powerful raiders rarely stayed particularly effective for long. It seems to me it's nearly impossible for a smaller navy to challenge a larger one without overwhelming economic superiority, especially since modern ships don't really have the blind spots of an Age of Sail one, where smaller ships can manoeuvre, stay in that area and fire with impunity. So due to the changes in technology, it does become a little bit different depending on whether you're in World War I or World War II. In World War I, I would say that the Imperial German Navy actually, under the leadership of Admiral von Tirpitz, got things almost precisely right in theory and almost precisely wrong in execution. Admiral Tirpitz's theory was the so-called risk theory, which was that if you built up a fleet that was of a reasonably substantial portion, size-wise, of the Royal Navy, then the Royal Navy wouldn't want to fight you, because even though it could beat you, then it would lose enough ships that other rival powers would be able to pile in and then defeat it. And so in order to keep everybody at bay, it would choose not to fight you. Broadly speaking, in a World War I context, it's not a bad plan. Unfortunately, there's a very delicate balance point to make it work, and unfortunately it also does involve some politics, and this is where Germany tripped itself up. Because, I mean, there's larger issues as to why the German policy failed, because there was the whole land contingent and the British not wanting a European hegemon and all of that, which is an entirely separate line of military thinking. But in terms of the purely naval side of things, Britain could accept Germany having a modern navy. And Britain could accept America having a modern navy, or France, or Russia, or whoever. What they couldn't accept was a navy that came close enough to break their two-power standard. And that's what Germany was doing. And Germany, of all the powers, probably had the least justification in the eyes of the British to be building up a modern navy. The Japanese were another island nation, so the British could understand that. The Russians, well, they just had their fleet trashed by the Japanese, so rebuilding there was relatively understandable. France had been a historical rival of Britain, and with its Atlantic coast had relatively substantial maritime interests and colonial interests. America, albeit one massive part of the North American continent, obviously to reach anything meaningful beyond Canada, had to sail the seas, so a navy there was reasonable. Germany, however, had little to no colonial possessions and was slap bang in the middle of Europe, and therefore, by any measure, should have had much more important things to worry about than building the world's second largest fleet. At which point the British sort of looked at it and went, I have a suspicion you're going to use that, and the only reason you'd need a fleet that large would be to come after us. And then the Anglo-German arms race commenced. So, partially it's to do with position. As I said, Britain would tolerate somewhere like Japan building a significantly larger navy before they start to get worried than somewhere like Germany, where the use of such a fleet seems to be almost monotask. Likewise, with America, especially before the Panama Canal was opened, the British weren't too worried about an American naval build-up because America had to cover 2 entire oceans, and so even if their fleet was, say, 70-80% the size of the Royal Navy, the individual fleet that they could bring to bear without massively telegraphing their intentions would be significantly smaller, and therefore the Royal Navy could defeat it in detail. So part of being a smaller navy is going to depend very much around whose navy you are. And then comes the fine balancing act, because if you build your navy too small, you'll just get rolled over. You won't form a deterrent. But if you build your navy too large, Britain takes a look at you and goes, no, I don't think so. So you've got to strike a very fine balance there. And I say this is why the sort of the 2-power standard comes into play. If you can supplant one or the other nations that Britain's currently measuring itself against with the 2-power standard, but only just, then Britain is likely to either want to make an ally of you to counter the other two, or it'll just say, okay, well, there now, sort of that one and whoever else is left is now our 2-power standard. And they're not going to worry overly much. And this is where Germany kind of fell down. Britain was rating itself against France and Russia, was thinking about maybe switching over to dropping America into place of Russia, and then Germany just came bulldozing through the pack with a massive fleet and was like, right, you're the main threat then. Whereas if they'd capped their fleet at somewhere around the realms of maybe slightly, somewhere between the American and French battleship and cruiser building projects, Britain probably would have been fine with it. And I'm saying Britain a lot, but in World War I period, that's basically what this question is about when it comes to challenging a larger navy. Because, to be fair, when you talk about dreadnoughts, almost everybody else by that point had built so few dreadnoughts that just having dreadnoughts meant that you were pretty much deterring everybody else. What with the French and the Russians and the Americans only churning out maybe half a dozen or so before the war actually properly broke out. Obviously each, not collectively. So, yeah, if you're going to go for a battle fleet, which you pretty much do need, then you've got to strike that fine balance of numbers and be good with location. And then the final part of it is, when it comes to deterrence, is politics, unfortunately. If you're going to build a fleet of that scale, try and identify somebody who's maybe a couple of dreadnoughts down the pecking order and form a decent alliance with them. So if Britain's maintaining its 2-power standard, so around about the 1910s, you're talking about at this point. Therefore, if you're say Germany and you're moderating your build policy, you've got Germany, America, France, and Russia as your kind of candidates. At which point, make an alliance with one. Then individually, your fleets aren't large enough to make Britain worried. But if you have a relatively decent, if somewhat loose alliance, collectively, you then have the naval power that if Britain messes unnecessarily with one of you, the other one hopefully will back them up, and then you have actually enough power to pull in pull the British fleet in and go, right, you can challenge us, and then Tirpitz's version of risk theory comes into play, because Britain won't want to challenge both of you at once unless it goes and gets its own allies, and then politics ensues, shenanigans, etc. So yeah, World War One, go for a battle fleet that is about the scale of the nearby powers that are currently rated on the 2-power standard. Commerce raiding's just not worth it. Britain can outbuild you. Britain can just saturate the oceans, and once the battle cruiser's invented, sending cruisers out isn't going to help much either. The classic folly of that, you can look at something like Admiral von Spee's squadron. Perfectly trounced Craddock squadron at Coronel. Then the British turned up with a couple of battle cruisers, and that was basically that. Merchant raiders, again, as you mentioned, commerce raiding doesn't tend to work out very, very well. It annoys people, but you either go unrestricted, in which case it annoys everyone and turns everyone against you, or you're just pinpricking away without a massive submarine fleet. And, well, if you're going to build a massive submarine fleet, you are then, again, a rather obvious threat, which means someone's going to crack down on you very hard. It's this very fine balance of being just enough of a threat that they don't annoy you, but not making yourself such an obvious threat they feel they have to crack down on you. World War II is basically the similar kind of concept, except that you can tend to shy away a little bit from the shipping. So you look at something like, say, Sweden's navy actually managed exactly this. Smaller navy, well, didn't challenge, but did deter the larger navy of the Kriegsmarine, albeit the Kriegsmarine did have some rather larger rivals to worry about at the time. But so in World War II, the main things are the advances in submarine technology and the advances in aircraft. Now, as a smaller naval power, you're very unlikely to be able to build a carrier, and even if you can, it's probably a bad idea because the power that you're challenging will just show up with many. And as a smaller power, you're unlikely to have the colonial holdings that sort of necessitate a mobile airfield that you can take all over the world. So what you want to do at that point, I would estimate, would be to still have a small deterrent fleet made up of good quality cruisers and some heavy coastal defense ships. Again, don't bother with the commerce raiding, but designing some kind of small to medium-sized, fast submarines optimized for close-in operations is probably a good idea, because at this point submarine strikes can actually be very annoying. And invest heavily in aircraft for the World War II period. I mean, I know it means a bit of foreknowledge, because in the early 1930s, investing in aircraft as your anti-shipping, no, that's not going to happen. But in the late 1930s, certainly a possibility. Aircraft are much cheaper than ships, and even if you might be a smaller power, you will still have plenty of space on your country's home turf to build lots of airfields. So effectively what you want to try and do, as long as you don't share a land border or a very close sea crossing with the big power that you're trying to deter or challenge, you effectively want to try and spend the kind of money that your bigger power might spend on a battleship or an aircraft carrier, spend that on dozens, if not hundreds, of aircraft, because kind of like what the British enlarged with the armoured carriers, you fight close enough to an enemy shoreline when the enemy has a decent-sized air force, and you will get through. And if you've got a decent enough strike package, then certainly at the beginning of World War II, before the Americans start rolling out stupidly large numbers of Essexes, chances are the most someone can come at you with is a couple of hundred aircraft. And if you've got an air force that's land-based, therefore has heavier strike aircraft, and you have 400, 500, 600 plus, and you can concentrate them on coastal airfields, A, their carrier strike's unlikely to be able to do much to you, and B, your return strike is going to be pretty devastating, especially given the state of early World War II anti-aircraft in general. So that would be my recommendation for a World War II period. The thing is, at the end of the day, if you have a smaller navy and you can't build up to challenge the larger navy, you have a smaller economy, so you don't want to be directly challenging the larger fleet, because they will just end up burying you in ships. See what happened to Japan, for example. But you can deter with the right measures, providing you don't do anything colossally stupid like, oh, I don't know, try and blow up most of the enemy battle fleet in its home port without telling them you've declared war first. It's as much about political action as it is about building up a fleet, because you can build up the world's most perfect deterrent fleet, but if you sting or slap a bigger power enough times that they get really properly ticked off with you, they're just going to come and stomp you flat regardless of how perfectly formed your fleet was. Clayton Godet asks, he says, I'm very curious about the brains of a warship. What was the typical command staff structure like on a World War II vessel? What roles and responsibilities did each member have? And as a follow-up, during combat engagement, how much micromanagement did a battleship captain do? And then he mentions it might be a special video, and indeed it probably will be at some point. So yeah, the whole command and control structure element of warships in World War II is a massively complex topic, and it will eventually at some point have to be covered by a Wednesday special video, so I'm not going to go on for too long in this particular answer, but I'll give you some idea of the reason it has to be in that kind of video. Is the command staff and command structure on a World War II ship varied immensely depending on the kind of ship it was and the size of ship it was. So for a destroyer, obviously you can't fit too many people on the bridge in the first place, and, well, on most destroyers a lot of the armament and such was literally within yelling range, so the command staff would be a lot less numerous and the command structure would be a lot more fluid on a destroyer as compared to something like a heavy cruiser or a battleship, where you would have significantly more men on the present in and around the bridge and in various other centres like fire control systems, etc., and where, because of sheer size, every command has to be relayed by some form of external communication system, not screaming at the top of your lungs. Now, that changes again when you get into more specialist vessels like aircraft carriers, where you've got someone who has to command the ship itself and possibly direct things like air defence and hopefully not, but if necessary, surface defence, versus the people who are trying to conduct the air operations. And then again, when you go into submarines, it's a very enclosed environment, very small command staff, but you don't have to worry about certain things, but you do have to worry about other things that a surface ship doesn't have to worry about, which complicates things a lot more. So, for example, unless you are surfaced, you don't have to worry about gunnery, but you do have to worry about torpedoes and calculating angles, but that will usually be done by the captain, whereas on a surface ship, something like the gunnery fire control solutions would not be done by a captain. So there's an awful lot of variation, and therefore roles and responsibilities for any given crewman will vary immensely from the captain on down. So look forward to that at some point. I don't know whether it'll be this year or next year, but at some point in the future. Now, as regards micromanagement during a combat engagement, with a battleship captain, again, it somewhat does vary in situation, because if you are the captain of a battleship that's leading a squadron or a small unit, you have to worry about giving orders to relay to those other ships as well to a certain degree. Whereas if you are solo in command of a battleship, then you can just focus on your ship. Either if you're on your own completely, or if you're part of a squadron, you just have to receive orders and deal with what the squadron or flotilla or whatever unit leader is telling you to do. Now, the main goal of a captain, as trite as it might sound, is to command the ship, but that effectively involves being the hub and nexus of an awful lot of information and then making the decisions that put those various bits of information together. So, for example, engineering will be telling you how fast you're going. Your helmsman will be able to tell you what heading you're at. Your spotting crew, whether that be people physically up there with rangefinders and binoculars, or later on supplemented by radar operators, will be telling you what is around you, assuming that you can't see that yourself, which again, you're high up on the bridge, but you're not necessarily going to see the same things or in the same detail as someone who's got a dedicated bit of equipment for that. So you might see a battleship, but the person on the main rangefinder might then be able to tell you what kind of battleship it was, or perhaps that you've misidentified a heavy cruiser as a battleship, or vice versa. And obviously what it's doing. If there's any aircraft coming in, you'll have someone in charge of the anti-aircraft defense, and so on and so on. These people will be giving you feedback as the captain, and then you, taking into account the strategic situation, have to make the decisions that broadly dictate what's going to happen. But your micromanagement is not going to be right down to the nitty-gritty details unless you're actually probably a fairly bad captain on a battleship at that point. So the example given in the question would be, was it simply something like, see that enemy battleship to port, I don't want to, or would it be steer 20 degrees to port, set main battery, target enemy battleship to port, load AP, commence salvo firing, etc., etc. Somewhere in between. So course changes, the captain would generally order, or if it's a general instruction that might require a lot of finesse and on-the-spot decision-making, if he's got a good helmsman, he might just order a general concept to be followed. So captain might say, yes, I want to steer 20 degrees to port, and then in 2 minutes steer 15 degrees to starboard. Or he might just order his helmsman, chase the enemy splashes. And then he doesn't have to tell him anything else, because the helmsman will do that, steer the ship towards the last salvo that landed, which was similar to what HMS Rodney did. Depending on the captain's expertise, he might take over a certain role if he has a lot of prior experience with that. So let's say he had prior career experience as a fairly good helmsman, he might then take over the helm position if he wanted to. Although that requires a certain degree of confidence on the captain's part, both in his own skills and also a lot of trust in the skills of other members of his crew, because by taking over a specific role like that, he is of necessity going to be limiting the amount of time he can spend dealing with all the other stuff. So when it comes to things like targeting an enemy surface warship, he would choose the target, but it would be a case of, so let's say we're talking about something such as the Battle of the Denmark Strait. You've got two ships to choose from, so it might be target lead ship. But that would be as far as it goes. You wouldn't order load AP because you're fighting a battleship. Of course, the gunners are going to load AP. You trust them to do their job. And once you've said target lead, the lead ship, unless there is a specific reason to switch ammunition load from the default, you wouldn't say anything else. You might give the order to commence firing, and you might give the order for the kind of firing, initially speaking, but again, kind of like with saying chase the enemy splashes to your helmsman, you would probably give a more general set of instructions and then allow your officers to interpret that. So you might say target lead ship, range on half salvos, rapid fire when the range has been established. And that would set into train a whole sequence of events. So they'd be firing, again, taking the Battle of Denmark Strait as an example, and let's say we're aboard Hood, they'd be firing 4-gun salvos, trying to establish the range, waiting for the fall of shot before firing the next salvo, etc., with the intention that once the range has been established, they would then enter a rapid fire phase where they just fire as quickly as possible to try and do as much damage as possible. And the next thing your gunnery officer is probably going to report back is when the range is established, just to double check that the captain wants to stay with the rapid fire order because the situation might have changed by then. So that is how a good captain with a good crew that he trusts will tend to operate. Now, obviously, that doesn't necessarily mean that is how everybody operated. There may be crew that are inexperienced, that might need a bit more of a helping hand. The situation might be very fluid or very complicated that might require further instructions from the captain, or the captain might be very lackadaisical or incredibly OCD about making sure everything goes perfectly. But that's a general feel for how a sort of a gun battle engagement would tend to go. Obviously varying as in complexity as more and more factors are piled on board. In fact, one of the better ways of experiencing that, if you happen to be in the UK, and I guess I'll find out if there's anything like this in the States, would be if you happen to be in London, go aboard HMS Belfast, because they have a kind of looping recording of the sounds of the bridge during the engagement with Scharnhorst at the Battle of the North Cape, and that gives you a fairly decent idea of what was a fairly complex situation, but how the bridge crew and especially the captain handled that. And you'd be surprised, given the various complexity of manoeuvres, all the various ships that were present, and the danger that they were in, just how few commands are actually being spoken. Most of it is feedback that the captain's just taking on board. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks a trio of related questions, a bit like a Neapolitan ice cream, except inquiry-based. Would HMS Vanguard have been more effective with King George V's 14-inch guns instead of the 15-inch World War I era guns that were given to her? 2, would it have really been that much more expensive to install the new 14-inch guns? And 3, if you could add 5,000 tons of displacement to Vanguard to improve an already amazing ship, where would you place the allotted new tonnage? Now, the reason Vanguard was built the way she was specifically because they thought they could get a battleship out quicker than the lag time that would have been involved in ordering yet another King George V with 14-inch guns. And to be honest, they were right. If they'd actually kept on schedule with building Vanguard, she probably would have been in service before, at least before Howe, probably before Anson, despite being laid down later than both. I don't think she would have quite beaten Duke of York into service, but it might have been a close run thing. Now, that kind of precludes her having for the 14-inch guns, because would she be more effective? Well, if she was supposed to have been built with the 14-inch guns, she probably would have arrived in service even later than she historically did, at which point, well, there wasn't any more battleship fights to have. Now, in terms of being designed with the 14-inch guns, and let's say those supply bits are unblocked, or we're just talking about sheer firepower, probably actually not as effective, I would say. The 14-inch gun on the King George V was a relatively decent gun, but it was still only a 14-inch gun, and whilst the 15-inch gun was a much older weapon, it was a damn good older weapon, and with the various modifications that were made to the turret fire control systems, etc., and the latest and greatest Cardinal shells, and the ability to fire superchargers, now Vanguard had a fair bit of a punch. And given that the 15-inch gun turrets issues had been worked out considerably better than the King George V's 14-inch gun turrets for most of the Second World War, overall I'd say that the 15-inch guns probably, when operating at full capacity, made the Vanguard a bit more effective than the King George V's 14-inch guns, when you're just looking at the guns and their effectiveness in and of themselves. Would it have been more expensive to install new 14-inch guns? Well, effectively at that point you're building a kind of a halfway house between a Lion and King George V, because you're Vanguard's not quite the Lion hull, but it's closer to the Lion hull than it is the King George V hull. So you're kind of taking a near Lion hull with a King George V armament. Would have been more expensive? Yes, because the British had the 15-inch guns and the turrets. There was no cost associated with building them. There was a minor cost associated in pulling them out of storage, modernising them, getting them up to spec and installing them, but there wasn't the cost either in time or money of actually building them in the first place. So if you wanted to build the ship with 14-inch guns, you'd have to order a whole bunch of new 14-inch guns at the cost of a couple of £1 million, which is not necessarily cheap. And if I could add 5,000 tons of displacement to Vanguard to try and improve it, where would I put the allotted new tonnage? Well, that's a bit of a question, isn't it? Historically, when it was absolutely rammed to the gunwales with absolutely everything, plus acting as a royal yacht, it was a bit top-heavy. So some of that displacement would probably have to go into addressing that, making the hull a little bit larger, therefore a bit more stable and able to support the needs that it was put to, albeit that, again, is exercising a little bit of future knowledge. They certainly weren't anticipating Vanguard being converted into a royal yacht at the time they were constructing her, to say the least. If I was looking at it from a pure combat capacity, and I was starting early enough, given that it was going to get, again, the problem is with the future knowledge, if I knew it was going to get delayed, I'd probably insist on continuing development on the 16-inch guns that the Lions were supposed to have, or even the newer 15-inch guns that were originally considered for the King George V. And to be honest, at the time Vanguard's being considered probably the 16-inch guns for the Lions. And then just slightly enlarging the hull and obviously the barbettes and everything, so that instead of getting a ship with 8 good but old 15-inch guns, you end up with a ship that's mounting, say, 4 twin modern 16-inch guns. Or, to be perfectly honest, if you're adding 5,000 tons and spending the money for that, you might as well just build a Lion at that point, which would be quite amusing. A one-off Lion class. The alternatives to that would be probably eliminating the 5.25-inch armament. I mean, the 5.25-inch on Vanguard was as far cry from the 5.25-inch on King George V and Prince of Wales at the beginning of the war, and it did have a role as a fairly long-range kind of sniper AA gun, but given the evolving threats at the time, I might be tempted to eliminate the 5.25-inch secondary battery and instead install the latest 4.5-inch guns. You could get more of them, and they're a lot more rapid fire. I'd really like to put the 3-inch rapid fire, but that's pushing it a bit too far because that wasn't ready till the 50s. So, yeah, a more numerous 4.5-inch AA battery over the 5.25-inch will probably be the other alternative. I mean, with 5,000 tons, there's an awful lot of displacement to add to a ship. The armour's fine. So, yeah, I think if I had my dream list, it would be make the ship a little bit bigger to be able to receive the Lion class's 16-inch guns in, well, let's say that 4 twin turrets, because that's how the ship in general was laid out, and replace the 5.25s with, instead of having 8 of them, maybe have 10 or maybe even 12 4.5-inch turrets, or mounts, depending on what you want to call them, on either side. Or possibly, if we're going to really get into it, maybe even look at, with 5,000 extra tons, having some of them on down the sides and lengthening the ship or reconfiguring the superstructure so I can have maybe 1 fore, 1 aft behind the super firing main gun turrets. That'll probably increase the displacement up to that kind of level. Matt Kidd asks, I was watching Master and Commander Far Side of the World the other day, and one of the most striking shots was when Acheron and Surprise were right next to one another, with the Acheron completely dwarfing the Surprise. So at 28 guns and 198 souls, Surprise is something like an Enterprise class 6th rate frigate, right? Yes, that would be correct. And with more than twice our guns and more than twice our numbers, Acheron is effectively USS Constitution. Kind of. It's loosely based on the 10th novel in the series, which is actually a US super frigate, specifically the USS Norfolk, but that's a fictional ship. But yeah, you might as well say it's the Constitution. So my question is Lucky Jack actually insane Jack for trying to fight Acheron, which, as his officers point out, is completely out of Surprise's class? And would Lucky Jack actually have had a chance at all against an American super frigate in a 6th rate? It seems dubious, as British 5th rates were handily defeated by the Constitution. Are there any historical examples of mismatches in this extreme being won by the underdog in the Age of Sail? So, yes, and frequent viewers of this series of videos will probably be sick and tired of me talking about Lord Cochrane capturing a very large Spanish frigate using a ship that was probably around about the same size, if not possibly slightly smaller than the Surprise. So, yeah. Yeah, so I won't recount that again, but that is a classic example of, yes, there were quite a few examples of very extreme mismatches being won by the underdog. Now, in terms of this particular engagement where, for lack of a better term, you have an American super frigate, the Acheron was turned into a French ship that was suspiciously based on American super frigate designs in the film, basically because, well, the film was produced by Americans and they didn't fancy alienating their home audience by making an American ship the bad guy, so they basically just took down the stars and stripes and stuck up the tricolor. But anyway, yes, on paper, Acheron is completely out of Surprise's class, and in the film, this is acknowledged. They cannot hope to beat the Acheron in a straight-up gunfight, so they decide they needed to get in right up close, by using disguise, and then engage in a short-range firefight along with a boarding action. Now, that is not quite as insane as it sounds if you can close the range, and also is a relatively nice nod to HMS Surprise's actual armament. Now, the thing is, most cannons, although you do get sort of the nickname of Constitution as Old Ironsides and the reputation of other American super frigates being also very tough, and to a certain extent that is legitimately earned, they were tough. They weren't as tough as sort of pop history tries to make them out. Constitution and other American super frigates did regularly withdraw from combat once they had overall won in order to effect repairs, both to their mast and rigging and to their hulls. Their hulls were penetrable by things like 18-pounder long guns, but you had to get a bit closer than normal to do so because their hulls were, in overall protective terms, a little bit more like engaging a small ship of the line than a frigate. And a 24-pounder could blast straight through to see the engagement between Endymion and HMS President. So, they're tough, they're not invincible to frigate-caliber guns. The main thing is that if an American super frigate is carrying long 24s, they can punch through the hull of a fifth-rate frigate at a considerably longer distance than a fifth-rate frigate carrying long 18s can punch through their hull in return. And that kind of, well, what would later be called in Dreadnought era terms a zone of immunity, that is where their reputation for extreme toughness comes from. But Surprise, as we were mentioning, although very small and although armed very lightly with 8-pounders and 4-pounders when it was French as the Unité, which is its country of origin, it was inducted into the Royal Navy, and Surprise under the Royal Navy's command was armed almost in many ways a bit like the USS Essex was, with a massive load of 32-pounder carronades and some 18-pounder carronades and a few chase guns. So to get right up close, it's pretty much the only thing they can do at that point because their carronades are short range. But then if they actually succeed in getting close enough, well, they've got a broadside of a dozen 32-pounder carronades, almost half a dozen 18-pounders. That'll do a hell of a lot of damage to whatever you end up fighting. So, and also with its size, if the Acheron in this case is using double gun decks, you can at very close range pull off a kind of Lord Cochrane style trick of actually getting in below the firing arc of their upper guns, at which point you're going lower gun deck to main gun deck, and if you've got a bunch of 32-pounders and they've got a bunch of, say, 24-pounder long guns, which is very likely, you've reduced their numerical advantage to rough parity by eliminating the ability of the upper gun deck to really do all that much damage to you. And then you have 32-pounders and they have 24-pounders, which means, ironically, you actually have more firepower. And at close range, the lower velocity of the carronade is not so much of an issue. In fact, it's a benefit because a long 24 fired through the side of a sixth-rate like Surprise is basically going to punch straight through and out the other side, and leaving a relatively neat hole in whatever it passed through. Whereas a larger 32-pounder cannonball fired from a carronade at low velocity will still quite happily punch through the side of something like the Acheron, but it will do so causing a lot more damage and leaving a much larger hole because of the slightly lower impact velocity and spraying splinters everywhere. So actually, in a very, very, very close range fight like that, the Surprise has an advantage. In fact, that's literally the only scenario in which the Surprise has an advantage. So in a circumstance where you are having to engage such a ship in, like the Acheron, in a ship like Surprise, disguising yourself to get in literally to touching distance and then blasting away with every gun you've got in a surprise attack is actually, albeit something of a maneuver of desperation, but in and of itself a remarkably sound strategy, and one that may very well win you the day, assuming that you actually get to the point where you can open fire first. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in the lead up to that. So, yeah, it's not something that you would just try if you were just any captain, but if you're someone who's as skilled as Lucky Jack Aubrey, sure, go for it. You've got as good a chance as anything else of working. Christopher Wittmer asks, he says, I'm an aspiring writer, so I'd like your advice on writing about real and fictional ships, although, to be honest, I'm world building a fantasy world, so more interested in the fictional ships. So often fictional writers get these things wrong, so I'm aiming to make my story feel as real as possible, even if there is magic and fantasy creatures, etc. Because the more real it feels, the more immersive it will be. And he also suggests it might be a sort of a Wednesday special video, which indeed it... Yeah, trying to give writing advice on how to get the context of warships right. Yeah, that'll be a long old video, but I'll do my best to do a summary in this case. So again, trying to do things relatively briefly and only covering at the higher levels of detail. There are certain fictional books, like the aforementioned Master and Commander series or the Hornblower series, that offer good examples of how to do ships well in fiction. So that's certainly something that can be looked into, albeit obviously they are works of fiction. There are exaggerations and sort of authorial fiats for the purposes of the story, so bear that in mind. But they do give you an idea of how ships can be written well in a fictional setting. So that's always a good idea. Now, in terms of there's 4 points that you raised as sort of the basis for the longer video, but I'll try and cover them very briefly. The most common mistakes when creating fictional ships or writing about ships in general. The single biggest mistake that I think I've seen most that will break the suspension of disbelief for anyone who knows much about shipping is speed of response. I mean, even in modern ships, but especially in older ships, World War II, World War I, or back to the Age of Sail, if a captain gives an order to do something, an awful lot of books, it just happens. Like you're driving a car. So if the captain says, right, turn 90 degrees to port, the ship just almost immediately starts turning. And yeah, so like you're in a car, come up to a junction, you just pull the wheel left. Ships don't react that quickly. As I say, even these days, they tend not to react that quickly. I mean, heck, to even just take a narrowboat or a small boat out and put the wheel hard over and see there is actually a delay in response, and make that much larger for a capital ship, and yeah, you get the general idea. And then you get to something like an Age of Sail ship, where to make some kind of major course correction like that will probably require a significant amount of work to be done to the ship's rigging and sails, and it can be a matter of several minutes before a ship starts to respond. Likewise, ships don't sail around with their guns primed and ready, so when a captain, let's say in an emergency situation, says, "Oh, fire at that ship," in a lot of sort of vaguely historical fiction, the guns speak almost immediately. Whereas more realistically, if they're in a surprised situation, the guns will have to be, at the very minimum, loaded, run out, aimed, and then fired. And in any kind of large vessel, that's going to be the work of, at best, 30 seconds, probably several minutes again. The pace of naval combat up to the era of missiles is actually remarkably slow in anything other than destroyers and such like. Although battleship guns can be said, that's what people say, oh well, this gun has a fire rate of like once every 20 seconds, once every 25, or once every 30 seconds. Yeah, that's the theoretical maximum fire rate. I challenge you to point me to any kind of engagement where that was sustained for any considerable period of time, if at all. The most common average rate of fire is around a salvo or a minute or so with the big guns. So it takes a while for combat to occur. I mean, once things start exploding, things happen very quickly. But yeah, the general feel of the speed of action is something that I would say is a clear marker of someone who understands what they're doing when it's done properly. Now, where to begin when creating fictional ships? Well, it depends entirely on how far off the deep end of fantasy you want to go. Kind of like with the Spring Sharp video, where I suggested trying to roughly approximate a existing vessel and then extrapolate down from there for your preferred choice. I mean, I have written -- I'm in the process of writing in my off time, and I have been for a few years, a sort of fictional steampunk magic-esque novel that's based on airships and ironclad warships and everything. But that's my personal hobby. But when it came to designing both the airships and the naval ships for that universe, I started with historical designs. So early Zeppelins, centre battery ironclads, that kind of thing. I went, right, this is what real ships looked like. Then taking into account any sort of slightly reality bending elements that you might have in your universe, you go, right, well, how could I change this to a form that I want, or a form that serves the purposes of the story within the scope of how much I'm changing reality. So it could be something as simple as changing the screw propellers for, say, Archimedes screw propellers, or introducing a full-on downward sloping massive ram bow, or whatever you want to do, or making it out of mithril, I suppose, if you're going to do some kind of steampunk Lord of the Rings thing. But yeah, to try and create a fictional ship, if you're not going completely off the deep end of fantasy, try and find a ship that at least vaguely approximates what you're trying to get to in real life, and then extrapolate from there. Because you hopefully should be able to tell where you might be going completely overboard and unrealistic at that point, based on what you have to start with. How to capture the feel of life on a ship? Nothing beats reading first-hand accounts. So if you're going for an Age of Sail style feel, look for accounts from there. If you're ironclads, obviously late 19th century, Dreadnought era, World War I, World War II, there are plenty of decent books out there and even online resources, to be honest, that have transcribed either diaries or accounts, or even in the latter cases, recordings of people describing how life was. So read or listen to or watch those, because nothing beats someone actually telling you this is how it was. I mean, if you're going for a more modern setting and you happen to know someone who either was or currently is in the Navy, then obviously ask them and see what they say. But always try and get a wide range of sources, because an account from a gunner is going to be very different to the account of an engineer, is going to be very different to the account of someone who was mainly in charge of maintaining the catapult for the ship's aircraft. And also try and look for a ship that roughly matches the capabilities that you want, because the account of, say, the engineering crew of a destroyer is going to be very different to the account of an engineering crew of a battleship. And on a battleship, you're going to have people who are maybe working down in the magazines for massive 14, 15 or 16-inch guns, whereas on an aircraft carrier, you're going to have a lot of people working in hangar decks. But yeah, nothing beats just listening to real-life accounts, both of general day-to-day activities and in action. And that pretty much addresses the other part of how to accurately portray relationships between crews and officers and captains. You can look at some sort of secondary sources, people who have written about it, albeit that you do have to be a little bit careful, because when it comes to that kind of thing, especially when you get back to the Age of Sail, sometimes the politics of certain authors can bleed through very much, and you either get this thing about Marxist class struggle as expressed in the 18th century Royal Navy or some other similar nonsense, or going right off the other end of things, how like the prize system is somehow an exemplar of capitalism and democracy as expressed by 17th century piracy, or some other weird and wonderful ideas. So yeah, view those with a little bit of a pinch of salt. Try and stick to more established naval historians in that respect. But again, certainly memoirs and accounts of sailors, the sort of the good lengthy ones, are again your best source for those. So yeah, there's a little bit of a ramble on about that, but hopefully that covers something of what you're looking for, and at some point maybe I'll do a longer video on that with some sort of case study examples thrown in. Christopher Dent asks, in the Fubuki video you mentioned that later examples of the class had 3 rather than 4 boilers due to higher efficiency, connected to 2 shafts. How is it possible to connect an odd number of boilers to an even number of shafts? So yes, at first that might seem to be a little bit self-contradictory. However, this is accomplished by the intervening turbines, because remember, boilers are there to generate pressure through steam, and you don't just sort of, well, bathe the propeller shafts in hot steam and hope that something happens. I know that sounds a little bit facetious, sorry. No, as part of the powertrain, the boilers generate the steam goes through the turbines provide the rotational energy, by this point through gearing. That is the cogs and spokes and teeth, not the small American destroyer. But yeah, so if you have 3 boilers, it's entirely possible to run 2 shafts off of it, because what you would do is you would take the steam from one of the boilers, the third one, I guess, and you could feed that either equally, or if one or the other of the boilers was at lesser or greater pressure, at a slightly off-kilter distribution, into the 2 turbines that would be powering the propeller shafts in question. So you'd have, sort of, say, if everything's working absolutely perfectly, 100% output from boiler 1 goes into one shaft. Let's say 100% boiler output from boiler 3 goes into the other turbine. Sorry, not shaft. So boilers 1 and 3 are supplying turbines 1 and 2, and then you'd just have a splitter from boiler 2 that would go, right, 50% steam into there, 50% steam into there, and so you have 150% of a boiler's capacity of steam going to each turbine, and then each turbine drives its own propeller shaft. So hopefully that makes a certain amount of sense. At least that's how it works in ships that are using turbine drive in that manner. In American ships using turbo-electric drive, there's a whole extra series of steps which gets even more entertaining. And Aaron Davis asks, another oddball one to have fun with, well, seems appropriate to conclude this video on. There was a question previously about how a World War I or II battleship would do at the Battle of Trafalgar. Shockingly, the answer was very well. However, what would be the smallest or least combat effective World War I or World War II ship that you feel could take the place of the British fleet and win the battle? A couple of ideas that occur to Aaron are a Flower-class corvette, a motor gunboat with some extra machine gun ammo, a Liberty ship with a 4-inch gun, and a bunch of troops with small arms, or maybe a fully unarmed merchant vessel that was just big enough to ram everything. Now, the large ship that's completely unarmed but is just sort of rolling on going, move, get out the way, etc., with all that stupid nonsense, that could possibly well do it. I mean, there's some pretty hefty ships around by that point that would fall into that category, large liners and such. And, well, the biggest and heaviest ships present at Trafalgar probably only weigh 4,000 or 5,000 tons at most. So, yeah, that could definitely be a thing. The only reservation that I would have there is 1, maneuverability, and 2, merchant ships are probably some of the few steel ships around whose hulls could be made into Swiss cheese by mass cannon fire. And also, well, their bows are not particularly built for ramming, so they might crush a few ships, but their own bows would be so smashed in they'd probably end up sinking themselves at some point. Now, in terms of a ship that might be able to pull that off a little bit better and not die, whilst also not being particularly armed, if at all, you'd probably actually want, if there were any, especially if we're talking about World War I, maybe some of the older iron merchant ships. Now, Great Eastern, unfortunately, had been broken up at that point because, well, the idea of Great Eastern going around like some gargantuan multi-powered trireme taking apart everyone at the Battle of Trafalgar is just hilarious, but something of that ilk, so a large, early iron ship, because their bows were strengthened in many cases for some form of, not necessarily ramming, but impact. That might be able to do it, or certainly do enough damage that the Franco-Spanish fleet retreats. When you talk about merchant ships and other small ships like that, again, their hulls are somewhat vulnerable, so you could rely on just sheer size. So, a Liberty ship maybe with a single gun probably is going to run out of ammunition before it gets to do anything, but maybe an armed merchant cruiser something in the 20,000 plus ton range, armed with half a dozen or more 4.76-inch guns. That kind of thing could probably do a real number at the Battle of Trafalgar, because, yeah, it's big enough to take a bunch of cannon hits. There's going to be so few crew compared to its volume that no one's probably really going to notice all that much. And, yeah, at point blank range you can barely miss, and those kind of guns would deal a lot of damage out, especially if they're using HE. The motor gunboat, no. The motor gunboat is one of the ones I definitely wouldn't want to be on, because even if you do have a few cases of extra MG ammo, all it takes is some sensible person to load a sort of a full 50-gun broadside of grape shot, and, well, it was nice knowing you. Flower-class corvette, similar to the armed merchant cruiser. The only restriction with the Flower-class corvette would be, well, it's got a lot less room to take damage. It's not got armour, so I'd be hesitant with that one, just because if it did get sort of caught up in close range action, there's a fairly high chance that might actually incapacitate it. And at longer ranges, it runs again into the same issue the Liberty ship would, of I don't necessarily know if it's got enough ammunition. So yeah, I mean, a destroyer could probably do the job, because a destroyer with multiple guns, decent ammunition stockpiles, torpedoes, and the speed would be able to stay at range and just shell everything with impunity. So yeah, something along the lines of a destroyer. Something with, basically you need something with multiple guns to ensure enough ammunition is your main restriction, and, well, destroyers have a decent fire control system by World War II at least, so that'll give you the range you need to stay out of cannon range, basically. So yeah, if you're going down to smallest warship, probably a destroyer, maybe a destroyer escort, just as long as it's got plenty of HE around. And if you're going with something that's not a classical warship, yes, a largish armed merchant cruiser will probably have a fair bit of fun. And to be honest, at that point, even an armed merchant cruiser that's mostly kitted out for anti-aircraft work with sort of Bofors 40mm and such would probably do relatively well, considering just how much damage you could do with, say, a quad Bofors mount. And that brings us to the end of this video. So thank you very, very much for listening. This is not the second to last Patreon special before I head out to America. The next Patreon special will go live when I'm actually in Boston. So there's that to look forward to, and it means I've got a lot of recording to do before I head away. But there you go, such is life. So, yep, thank you very much for listening, and see you again in another video.